High on the desert mesas of northern Arizona, a people have lived in the same villages for over 1,000 years, among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. But beneath the Hopi's quiet endurance lie questions that still unsettle historians. Why did entire clans vanish from Sikyatki and Awatovi, leaving pottery kilns cold mid-fire? What drove one Hopi village to destroy another in a massacre few outsiders even know occurred? And what do centuries-old prophecies passed down through ceremony actually foretell? These aren't legends, they're historical puzzles, still unsolved. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Where the Little Colorado River carves through the Grand Canyon's eastern reaches, a small travertine dome rises from the canyon floor. Pale, mineral-streaked, and quietly astonishing. To geologists, it's a limestone formation, built up over centuries by mineral-rich spring water. But to the Hopi people, this formation marks something far older and far more sacred. The Sipapu, the place where their ancestors first emerged into this, the fourth world. The Hopi origin narrative describes a journey through 3 previous worlds, each destroyed by the failures of those who lived in them. Corruption, imbalance, forgetting what mattered. Emergence into this world came through a hollow reed, a passage upward into light. The Sipapu is remembered as that threshold. It is not simply a myth told for comfort. For many Hopi, it remains an active place of pilgrimage, prayer, and ceremony, tied directly to clan migrations that, according to oral tradition, spread outward from this single point across the American Southwest. Archaeologists studying the region have found something worth pausing on. Settlement patterns across northern Arizona do seem to radiate outward in a manner loosely consistent with Hopi migration accounts, with village sites dating back centuries, some over 1,000 years old. Pottery styles, architectural techniques, and clan symbols appear to trace lineages that align, at least in broad strokes, with the oral histories passed down through generations. This is not proof of a literal emergence event, but it is evidence that the stories carried real information, real memory, encoded across time. And yet questions remain that no excavation has answered. Why this particular location, isolated and difficult to reach, rather than a more accessible site? Why do multiple Hopi clans describe the same general point of origin, despite migrating from different directions and settling different mesas? Oral tradition insists on a shared point of convergence, but convergence toward what, exactly? Some researchers have proposed that the Sipapu functions less as a literal geographic marker and more as a conceptual one, a story place meant to unify disparate clans under a shared cosmology rather than pinpoint an actual location. Others push further into more speculative territory, suggesting that emergence narratives found not just among the Hopi, but among unrelated cultures across the globe, from Mesoamerica to Southeast Asia to parts of Palestine and the broader Near East, might point toward some common ancient experience. A flood, a migration, a memory of catastrophe reshaped into myth over thousands of years. These comparative theories remain unproven, and many scholars caution against flattening distinct cultural traditions into a single global narrative. But the pattern, if it is one, is difficult to entirely dismiss. What makes the Sipapu resistant to easy explanation isn't the geology. That part is understood. It's the layering of meaning on top of it. A mineral dome becomes a doorway becomes a memory becomes a map, one that seems, in fragments, to correspond to something real on the ground. Today, the site remains largely closed to outside visitors, protected both by its remoteness and by Hopi wishes to preserve its sanctity. Few non-Hopi have seen it in person. Fewer still have been permitted to document it in detail. So the mystery persists, not because the location is unknown, but because its full meaning remains just out of reach. Is the Sipapu simply a striking natural formation, elevated by generations of storytelling into something sacred? Or does it mark the convergence point of something larger, older, and not yet fully understood? For now, The canyon keeps its silence. The canyon keeps its silence. Yes. But not every doorway the Hopi speak of lies exposed to the sky. Beneath the mesas themselves, in a darker register of the same emergent story, another passage is said to exist. Not a threshold walked through once in the ancient past, but a refuge, one the Hopi believe still waits beneath the earth, ready to be used again. They are called the Ant People. In Hopi tradition, they are not insects in any literal sense, but a race of beings, small, industrious, and profoundly knowledgeable, who dwell in vast underground chambers beneath the Southwest. According to the oral histories, it was the Ant People who sheltered the ancestors of the Hopi during the destruction of previous worlds, teaching them how to store food, live communally, and endure scarcity. Their kindness is remembered with a specific kind of reverence. Not worship exactly, but deep gratitude, the kind reserved for a debt that can never quite be repaid. The legend does not end in the past tense. Hopi elders have spoken of the Ant People's underground refuges as a kind of standing shelter, a place their descendants may need again, should the world above fall into the kind of imbalance that destroyed the worlds before this one. Some accounts describe specific entrances, caves in the cliffs near the village of Oraibi, or openings along the Colorado River, said to be marked in ways only the initiated would recognize. What makes this legend difficult to file away as pure myth is the geology of the region itself. Northern Arizona sits atop an extensive network of limestone, sandstone, and volcanic rock, riddled with genuine cave systems, lava tubes, and eroded chambers. Some mapped, many not. The Southwest is not short on real underground spaces capable of sheltering people for extended periods. Archaeologists have documented ancestral Puebloan storage cists, granaries, and dwellings built into cliff alcoves and rock shelters throughout the region, some dating back over 1,000 years, used precisely for the kind of long-term food storage and shelter the Ant People legend describes. The practical wisdom embedded in the story: store your food, build inward, prepare before disaster arrives, maps onto behavior archaeologists can actually verify in the material record. But verified granaries are one thing. A hidden, populated underground refuge is another entirely. And this is where the story shifts from plausible cultural memory into far stranger territory. In the early 20th century, the legend found an unlikely amplifier. In 1909, a mining engineer named S.A. Jordan claimed to have discovered a vast underground complex within the Grand Canyon itself, reportedly described in an Arizona Gazette article that spring. The piece described tunnels, chambers, and artifacts suggesting an ancient civilization with possible ties to Egypt or Southeast Asia, populated, some later retellings claimed, by figures uncannily close to the Ant People of Hopi tradition. No verified photographs surfaced. No follow-up expedition confirmed the find. The National Park Service has never acknowledged the existence of such a site, and most historians regard the article as either an elaborate hoax or a promotional stunt tied to tourism in the newly designated national park. And yet the story has proven remarkably durable, resurfacing in books, documentaries, and online forums for over a century, each retelling adding new details the original never contained. Why does a single, unverified 1909 newspaper article still generate expeditions and speculation more than 100 years later? Perhaps because it arrived, conveniently or not, atop a story the Hopi had already been telling for generations, giving outsiders a frame through which to imagine something that indigenous tradition had never presented as a treasure to be found, but as a covenant to be honored. That distinction matters. For the Hopi, the Ant People are not a lost civilization waiting for discovery by strangers. They are part of a living relationship, one bound up with humility, reciprocity, and the responsibility to live in balance with the land. Turning their story into a hunt for hidden chambers and buried gold, as some fringe theorists have attempted, arguably misses what the legend was built to communicate in the first place. Still, the comparative mythologist in anyone might notice something worth sitting with. Stories of small, Wise, subterranean beings who once aided humanity in crisis appear in various forms across cultures with no plausible contact. Among certain Mesoamerican traditions, in parts of northern Europe, even in folklore stretching toward the ancient Near East and Palestine. Are these independent inventions, arising naturally from shared human fears of catastrophe and shared instincts toward underground shelter? Or do they preserve something else? A memory, however distorted, of behavior once common to vulnerable communities facing the same basic problem. How do you survive when the world above becomes uninhabitable? No mainstream archaeologist claims evidence of an actual ant people civilization. No verified chamber has ever been found matching the 1909 account, and Hopi tradition itself resists being reduced to a treasure map, insisting instead on meaning over location. But the caves are real. The storage practices are real. The instinct to prepare, to shelter, to remember kindness shown in crisis. That too is real, etched into the archaeological record whether or not the ant people walk there themselves. So the question lingers, quieter than a headline but harder to dismiss. When the Hopi speak of a refuge still waiting beneath the mesas, are they describing a memory reshaped into legend? Or a warning, still valid, about a shelter none of us have found yet? A shelter beneath the mesas asks for patience, for a memory to prove itself over time. But some Hopi prophecies point not downward into the earth, but upward into the night sky itself, waiting for a single sign that has not yet, by most accounts, arrived. Among the most widely discussed of these is the prophecy of the blue star Kachina, Sakwasohu, in the Hopi language. According to Hopi tradition, the blue star is the ninth and final sign preceding the end of the fourth world and the emergence of the fifth. It is said to appear as a blue star, visible in the sky, whose arrival will herald a period of purification, a term Hopi elders have used carefully, not as a promise of apocalypse in the popular sense, but as a description of necessary, difficult transition, one that separates those living in balance from those who are not. The prophecy itself is part of a larger structure. Hopi elders have described a sequence of signs, some fulfilled, they say, others still pending, passed down orally for generations before ever being written down or shared publicly. These include the arrival of white-skinned men, bearing new ways of living, the coming of iron snakes across the land, and a great spiderweb of highways built to connect distant places. Many Hopi and researchers alike have pointed to the railroad, the interstate highway system, and telegraph or telephone lines as apparent fulfillments of these earlier signs. Whether these correspondences represent genuine predictive insight, retroactive interpretation, or simply the natural trajectory of any long-inhabited culture watching technology arrive from outside, this remains appropriately a matter of perspective rather than settled fact. The blue star sign is different in one important respect. It has not been definitively claimed as fulfilled. This alone sets it apart from the earlier signs in the sequence, and it is precisely this unresolved status that has made it a magnet for outside attention. Historically, the prophecy entered wider public awareness in the mid-20th century when Hopi elder Dan Kachongva began sharing aspects of Hopi prophecy with non-Hopi audiences, partly in hopes of warning the broader world about the consequences of imbalance and materialism. His accounts, along with those of other elders who chose to speak publicly, were later compiled and circulated in written form, a departure from a tradition that had, for centuries, been preserved almost entirely through oral transmission, spoken only within specific ceremonial and generational contexts. This shift matters for anyone trying to understand the prophecy today. Oral traditions, by their nature, are not static texts. They are living, contextual, and often layered with meaning that shifts depending on who is speaking, to whom, and why. Once transcribed and published, the Blue Star Kachina prophecy took on a kind of fixed public life it had never previously held, open to interpretation, extrapolation, and in some cases, considerable embellishment by audiences far removed from Hopi ceremonial context. And embellished it was. Beginning in the late 20th century, some outside interpreters began connecting the blue star prophecy to astronomical events. Comets, supernovae, even claims involving unidentified aerial phenomena. Some fringe theorists have proposed that the prophecy anticipates a literal celestial object, possibly a brown dwarf star or rogue planet, echoing similar claims found in other apocalyptic traditions circulating globally. Others have drawn loose comparisons to celestial omens described in far older texts. Star signs marking pivotal moments in tradition stretching from Mesoamerica to the ancient Near East, including astronomical portents recorded in regions now part of Palestine. These comparisons remain speculative and are not endorsed by Hopi religious authorities, many of whom have expressed discomfort with how freely the prophecy has been detached from its ceremonial and cultural context. This tension between a prophecy meant to be understood within a specific spiritual framework and a prophecy reinterpreted for a global audience hungry for signs sits at the heart of why the blue star Kachina remains so difficult to categorize. Is it a genuine predictive tradition, encoding observations about historical and celestial patterns across generations? Is it a moral framework, using the language of prophecy to encourage a way of living in balance with the earth, regardless of whether a literal star ever appears? Or is it something that has been reshaped so significantly by outside interpretation that its original meaning has become difficult to recover? What can be said with more confidence is this. The prophecy predates modern astronomical claims about it by generations, was maintained through careful oral transmission long before mass media took interest, and continues to hold serious meaning for Hopi communities today, independent of whether any outside audience considers it verified. That alone distinguishes it from many modern prophecy narratives invented retroactively to fit convenient events. No blue star, by consensus astronomical record, has appeared in the way the prophecy is popularly imagined to describe. No verified celestial event has been formally recognized by Hopi religious leadership as the fulfillment of Sakwasohu. And so the sign, if it is coming at all, remains, by the prophecy's own internal logic, still ahead of us rather than behind. Which raises a question that resists easy resolution. If the earlier signs in the sequence did, in fact, correspond to real historical developments, does that lend weight to the signs still unfulfilled? Or does it simply reflect how easily any long tradition can be read backward onto history, once someone is looking hard enough to find the pattern? A sign in the sky asks its audience to wait, but some Hopi traditions point to something more immediate, an object, small enough to hold in two hands, said to carry not a warning about the future, but a record of the past, entrusted to a specific lineage of keepers whose identity remains, even now, a matter of quiet dispute. These are the sacred tablets, stone fragments described in Hopi oral tradition as having been given to specific clans at the time of emergence into the Fourth World, meant to be kept, protected, and eventually presented again when the appointed moment arrives. The most frequently discussed is associated with the Fire Clan, and often referred to in popular accounts as the Fire Clan tablet, though Hopi tradition describes multiple tablets held by different clans, each said to carry a portion of a larger, incomplete instruction. According to the tradition, the tablets were broken deliberately at the time of separation, when different groups of the same original people went their separate ways, agreeing to reunite only when the fragments could be matched again, corner to corner, confirming that the reunited parties were indeed who they claimed to be. This detail matters enormously to how the tradition is understood. The tablets are not, in Hopi accounts, primarily objects of mystical power. They are described more like a covenant device, a verification system, almost bureaucratic in function, designed to prevent false claims of kinship or false prophets from deceiving the people in a future age of confusion. Historically, verifying any of this is extraordinarily difficult, and for good reason. Sacred objects of this kind are, by Hopi custom, not put on public display, not casually described to outsiders, and not treated as artifacts for academic study in the way a museum might catalog pottery or tools. What outside researchers know comes almost entirely through what Hopi elders have chosen, at specific moments and for specific reasons, to share. and Hopi religious leadership has historically been protective of these details, wary of exploitation, misrepresentation, or the kind of tourism-driven curiosity that has, in other contexts, led to sacred sites being disturbed or sacred objects removed. That caution has not stopped outside speculation from filling the silence. Beginning in the mid-20th century, as some Hopi elders spoke more openly to non-Hopi audiences, popular writers began drawing comparisons between the sacred tablets and other ancient traditions involving tablets or stones bearing sacred instruction. Most notably, comparisons to covenant traditions described in the ancient Near East and the region now called Palestine, where stone tablets also figure centrally in origin and covenant narratives. Some fringe theorists went further, proposing direct historical contact between ancient Near Eastern peoples and the ancestors of the Hopi, citing surface-level similarities in symbolism as evidence of shared origin or even literal shared authorship. Mainstream archaeologists and linguists have found no credible evidence supporting direct contact between ancient Near Eastern civilizations and the ancestral Puebloan peoples who became the Hopi. The similarities most often cited, tablets, covenants, emergence narratives, flood accounts, appear across numerous unconnected cultures worldwide, which most scholars attribute to shared human responses to catastrophe, migration, and the need to encode moral and historical instruction in portable, symbolic form, rather than to any literal historical link between distant peoples. And yet the comparison, however speculative, points to something worth sitting with honestly. The impulse to inscribe instruction onto stone, to fracture it deliberately as a test of legitimate return, to entrust fragments to different lineages who must one day reassemble them. This is a remarkably specific narrative structure to find echoed even loosely across cultures with no plausible historical contact. Is this coincidence, born of universal human logic about how to protect and verify sacred knowledge? Or does it suggest something else, harder to name, about how certain ideas recur across human civilization, regardless of geography? What can be said with more confidence is grounded in what Hopi tradition itself communicates, independent of outside comparison. The tablets are held, according to those accounts, by specific clans, most prominently the Fire Clan, historically associated with the village of Oraibi, among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. The keepers are not self-appointed. The role passes through specific ceremonial and genealogical lines, understood by the Hopi themselves to carry real responsibility rather than symbolic honor. And the tablets are described as incomplete, missing pieces, missing keepers, a covenant not yet fully reassembled. That incompleteness may be the most historically interesting detail of all. A story that claimed full resolution, an intact tablet, a confirmed keeper, a fulfilled reunion, would invite scrutiny of a different kind, the kind that can be examined, verified, or debunked outright. But a tradition that insists something is still missing resists that kind of closure by its very design. It does not ask to be proven. It asks to be waited for. So the question is not simply who holds the tablets today, though Hopi religious leadership would know, if anyone does. The deeper question is this: if a fragment is still missing, as tradition maintains, what would it mean for the Hopi, and perhaps for those far beyond the mesas, if it were ever found? A missing fragment asks us to wonder what might still be found. But some mysteries in Hopi history run in the opposite direction, not toward something hidden, but toward an absence so complete that entire communities, once thriving, simply stop appearing in the archaeological record at all. Scattered across the Colorado Plateau through Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Canyon de Chelly, and hundreds of smaller sites across present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, lie the remains of an extraordinarily sophisticated ancestral civilization. Multi-story stone dwellings built into cliff faces, elaborate road systems connecting distant settlements, astronomical observatories aligned with startling precision to solstices and equinoxes. For decades, this civilization was known primarily by a name assigned to it by outsiders, the Anasazi, a Navajo-derived term often translated imprecisely as ancient enemies. Today, the Hopi and many other Puebloan peoples prefer a different name for their own ancestors, Hisatsinom, meaning, roughly, people of long ago. The shift in terminology is not merely academic. It reflects a broader reclaiming of a story that, for much of the 20th century, was told largely without the input of the descendants who actually carried it forward. What makes the Hisatsinom genuinely mysterious is not that they vanished, in the dramatic sense popular media has often suggested. The Hopi themselves have never described their ancestors as having disappeared. Hopi oral tradition speaks instead of migration, clan by clan, over generations, moving from these earlier settlements toward the mesas where Hopi villages stand today. In this sense, there is no mystery of disappearance at all, only continuity that outside archaeology took a long time to recognize. And yet the archaeological record complicates even that clearer picture in ways that remain genuinely unresolved. Around the 12th and 13th centuries AD, a wave of rapid, widespread abandonment swept across the major Hisatsinom population centers. Chaco Canyon, once a hub of trade and ceremonial life supporting thousands, was largely emptied within a few generations. Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings, some of the most architecturally advanced structures in pre-contact North America, were constructed, occupied, and then abandoned within a strikingly compressed time frame. Some estimates suggest less than a century of intensive habitation before the mass departure. Mainstream archaeology points to a convergence of plausible, well-evidenced factors. Tree ring data confirms a series of severe prolonged droughts across the 13th century, some lasting decades, placing enormous strain on agricultural systems dependent on unpredictable rainfall. Evidence of resource depletion, deforestation, soil exhaustion, overhunting of local game, suggests populations may have simply outgrown what the land could sustainably support. And archaeological evidence at certain sites, including signs of violence and, more controversially, indications interpreted by some researchers as possible evidence of extreme conflict-related practices, has led some scholars to propose that social breakdown, warfare, or internal conflict accompanied the environmental pressures, accelerating the exodus. These explanations are not mutually exclusive, and most contemporary archaeologists favor a combination: environmental collapse triggering resource competition, triggering social strain, triggering the kind of coordinated, large-scale migration that Hopi oral tradition independently describes. In that sense, science and oral history increasingly appear to be describing the same event from different angles, converging rather than conflicting. But convergence is not the same as complete resolution, and several genuine puzzles remain. Why did some sites show signs of rapid, almost coordinated abandonment? Entire kivas sealed, ceremonial objects left in place as though residents intended to return, while others show evidence of more gradual decline. Why do certain migration routes described in Hopi clan histories correspond closely to verified archaeological trails, while others describe journeys to locations that remain, to this day, unidentified or unconfirmed by physical evidence? And why does Hopi tradition insist that the migrations were not merely a response to drought or hunger, but a spiritually mandated journey? Clans required to travel to the farthest corners of the continent before turning back toward the mesas, fulfilling a covenant tied to the emergent story itself, regardless of whether hardship demanded it. This last point deserves particular attention, because it represents a genuine divergence between mainstream archaeological explanation and Hopi understanding. Not a contradiction, necessarily, but a difference in what kind of question each is trying to answer. Archaeology, working from physical evidence, can reconstruct what happened: drought, migration, resettlement. It is considerably less equipped to explain why, in the deeper sense the Hopi tradition insists upon, as fulfillment of obligation rather than simple survival response. Some fringe researchers have proposed more speculative explanations for the rapid abandonments, invoking sudden disease outbreaks, unexplained population collapse, or even drawing loose comparisons to sudden civilizational declines documented elsewhere in the ancient world, from Bronze Age collapse narratives in the Eastern Mediterranean and Palestine to other pre-contact American cultures whose thriving centers likewise emptied within a few short generations. These comparisons remain unproven and are treated cautiously by most scholars, who caution against assuming shared causes simply because the timing or scale of collapse appears similar. What remains certain is this: The Hisatsinom did not vanish. Their descendants walk the mesas today, carrying names, clan histories, and ceremonial knowledge that trace directly back to Chaco, to Mesa Verde, to 100 smaller sites now empty of everything but stone and silence. But the deeper question, what finally tipped drought and hardship into full, coordinated abandonment, and how closely the physical evidence will ever align with the spiritual account the Hopi themselves maintain, remains open. Which leaves one to wonder, when a civilization leaves behind intact kivas, sealed doorways, and objects placed as though someone meant to return, what exactly were they migrating toward, and did they ever fully arrive? Did they ever fully arrive? For one Hopi village, the answer seemed for a time to be yes, until it wasn't. Beneath a low mesa near modern-day First Mesa, in northeastern Arizona, lie the eroded foundations of a settlement that once produced some of the finest pottery in the pre-contact Southwest, before falling silent sometime in the 16th or early 17th century, for reasons that remain even now unusually contested. This is Sikyatki, Yellow House, in Hopi, a village whose painted pottery is still considered by ceramicists and archaeologists alike among the most technically and artistically accomplished ever produced in the region. Distinctive yellow-orange slip, intricate abstract and figurative designs, bird and feather motifs rendered with remarkable fluidity. Sikyatki ware was so influential that it directly inspired the revival of Hopi pottery traditions in the early 20th century. Most famously through the work of the potter Nampeyo, who studied fragments excavated from the site and used them to reconstruct techniques her own generation had largely lost. Sikyatki was occupied for roughly 2 centuries, reaching a peak of prosperity and artistic achievement sometime in the 1500s. And then, within what appears to be a relatively short window, the village was abandoned. Its residents did not simply drift away gradually, as droughts elsewhere in Hopi history seem to have prompted. The archaeological picture at Sikyatki suggests something more abrupt, and Hopi oral tradition, notably, does not attribute the abandonment to environmental hardship at all. Instead, Hopi accounts collected in the 19th and 20th centuries describe something considerably darker: a massacre. According to versions of the story passed down among Hopi elders, tensions between Sikyatki and the neighboring village of Walpi escalated over a series of grievances. Accounts vary, some citing conflicts over women, others describing disputes involving sorcery accusations or violations of ceremonial conduct. What most versions agree on is the outcome. Warriors from Walpi and allied villages are said to have launched a coordinated attack on Sikyatki, killing much of the population, in some tellings specifically targeting the men while sparing women and children who were then absorbed into neighboring communities. This is where the mystery deepens, rather than resolves, because unlike many oral traditions describing distant, semi-mythical events, the Sikyatki massacre account is remarkably specific, geographically grounded, and consistently repeated across multiple independent tellings recorded by different ethnographers, including work compiled by Jesse Walter Fuchs in the late 1800s. And yet direct archaeological confirmation of a massacre, mass graves, widespread evidence of violent trauma across the skeletal record, burned structures consistent with a coordinated attack, has proven difficult to establish conclusively at the site, in part because Sikyatki has not been extensively excavated using modern forensic archaeological methods, and in part because Hopi communities have generally discouraged invasive excavation of ancestral village sites out of respect for the dead and a broader wariness toward outside disturbance of sacred ground. This creates a genuinely unusual situation in Hopi historical study. The oral tradition is detailed, specific, and consistently corroborated across independent sources. The physical evidence, whatever it might show, remains largely untested, not because it has been examined and found wanting, but because it has rarely been examined at all. Is this a case where oral history has preserved an accurate memory of real, violent conflict? The kind of internal warfare well documented among other Puebloan and southwestern societies during periods of resource stress and population pressure? Or has a genuine, more mundane abandonment, driven by drought, soil depletion, or simple relocation toward better land, been reinterpreted over centuries into a morality tale about the consequences of internal conflict and broken ceremonial obligation. Some researchers have noted that the timing of Sikyatki's fall roughly coincides with broader patterns of increased violence and site consolidation across the Pueblo and Southwest during the 15th and 16th centuries, a period when climatic stress appears to have intensified competition between villages more broadly. Under this reading, Sikyatki's destruction, if it occurred as described, would not be an isolated atrocity, but one localized instance of a wider regional pattern, one echoed in other traditions worldwide describing city-states or settlements destroyed by neighboring rivals during periods of scarcity, from the ancient Near East and Palestine to Mesoamerica. Others caution against this comparative approach, arguing that Sikyatki's story should be understood specifically within Hopi social and ceremonial context, rather than folded into a generalized pattern of ancient intercommunal violence. What remains undisputed is the pottery. Thousands of fragments and intact vessels recovered from the site since Fuchs's excavations in 1895. Technically brilliant, artistically singular, produced by a community that, by every account, possessed skill, sophistication, and cultural confidence right up until the moment it ceased to exist as an independent village. Whatever ended Sikyatki, it did not happen because the community had grown weak, forgotten its craft, or lost its capacity to thrive. So the mesa remains quiet, its foundations barely visible beneath centuries of erosion, its story preserved almost entirely in memory rather than in the ground. If the massacre occurred as Hopi tradition insists, the physical proof may simply be waiting, undisturbed, for someone willing to look. And if it did not, if drought or migration explains what happened instead, then a specific detailed story of violence would have to be explained on its own terms, as something other than simple memory. Either way, one truth remains unavoidable. Sikyatki's silence was not gradual. Something happened quickly. The only question still open is what and why. Something happened quickly at Sikyatki. But at least there, the questions outnumber the certainties. On Antelope Mesa, roughly 15 miles to the southeast, stands a site where the central event is not in doubt at all. What happened at Awatovi is documented, dated, and, in broad strokes, undeniable. What remains unresolved is something else entirely. Why a decision so violent was allowed to happen, and why the site itself was never resettled, left instead to stand empty for over 3 centuries. Awatovi was, by most archaeological and historical accounts, the oldest and among the largest of the Hopi villages at the time of Spanish contact, inhabited for centuries before European arrival, and home to a population that, by the late 1700s, may have numbered in the hundreds. It was also, notably, the site of the first Franciscan mission established among the Hopi, built in the early 1600s following the arrival of Spanish missionaries seeking to convert the Pueblo peoples of the region. For decades, Awatovi occupied a uniquely difficult position among Hopi villages, a place where traditional ceremonial life and an imposed Christian mission existed side by side, often in open tension. That tension exploded during the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, when Puebloan peoples across the Southwest, including the Hopi, rose in coordinated rebellion against Spanish colonial and religious control, killing missionaries and driving Spanish authority from the region for over a decade. Awatovi's mission was destroyed along with the others. But unlike most Hopi villages, Awatovi's population appears to have remained more receptive to renewed contact when Spanish influence began, tentatively, to return in the decades that followed. Franciscan missionaries re-established a presence at Awatovi around 1700, and it is this renewed openness to the mission and to Christianity itself that Hopi oral tradition identifies as the direct cause of what happened next. In the winter of 1700 or early 1701, according to accounts corroborated across multiple Hopi oral histories as well as later Spanish documentation, warriors from the other Hopi villages, reportedly including Walpi, Oraibi, and others, launched a coordinated, premeditated attack on Awatovi. The assault was not a raid in the ordinary sense. Accounts describe the destruction as deliberate and near total. Kivas set ablaze with the men of the village trapped inside during ceremonial gatherings, structures burned, and much of the population killed outright. Survivors, primarily women and children, were reportedly divided among the attacking villages and absorbed into their populations, in a pattern echoing what oral tradition also describes at Sikyatki generations earlier. What makes Awatovi historically distinct is the reasoning Hopi tradition assigns to the attack. This was not framed in most tellings as territorial conflict or resource competition. It was framed as an act of religious and cultural preservation, a decision made collectively by the other villages that Awatovi's continued openness to Christianity, and the internal discord it was generating within the village itself posed an unacceptable threat to Hopi spiritual integrity as a whole. Some accounts even suggest the attack was requested, or at least tacitly endorsed, by traditionalist factions within Awatovi itself, horrified by the direction their own village's leadership had taken. If accurate, this would mean the destruction of Awatovi was not simply an external assault, but something closer to an internal reckoning carried out with outside assistance, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of villages attacking a foreign target. Archaeological excavations conducted at Awatovi beginning in the 1930s, most extensively under the direction of the Peabody Museum's Awatovi expedition, confirmed substantial physical evidence consistent with sudden, violent destruction. Burned structures, evidence of conflict, and site abandonment occurring abruptly rather than gradually. This places Awatovi in a different evidentiary category than Sikyatki. Here, the physical record and the oral tradition largely agree, both in terms of the violence itself and its approximate timing. What remains unresolved is not whether the destruction happened, but what it reveals about a period of Hopi history rarely discussed with this level of detail. A moment when internal disagreement over how to respond to colonial religious pressure became severe enough to justify, in the eyes of those who carried it out, the elimination of an entire village. Most accounts of indigenous resistance to European colonization emphasize unified resistance against an external threat. Awatovi complicates that narrative considerably, describing instead a fracture within Hopi society itself over how far accommodation with outside religious influence could be allowed to go before it endangered everyone. Equally puzzling is what happened after. Unlike other abandoned Hopi sites that were sometimes resettled, repurposed, or at minimum, revisited for materials and ceremonial use, Awatovi was left conspicuously empty. Hopi tradition treats the site with particular solemnity, generally avoiding its resettlement out of respect for what happened there, though the precise ceremonial or spiritual reasoning behind this specific centuries-long avoidance has not always been shared in full with outside researchers. Some historians and cultural observers have drawn broader comparisons between Awatovi's story and other historical episodes in which internal religious conflict, rather than external conquest, determined a community's fate, citing parallels in colonial and religious history stretching from the Mediterranean world to the ancient Near East and Palestine, where communities have similarly fractured over questions of religious accommodation under external pressure. These comparisons remain interpretive rather than evidentiary, offered as context rather than explanation. What is certain is that Awatovi's destruction was neither accidental nor forgotten. It was deliberate, remembered in vivid and consistent detail by the very communities who carried it out, and marked by a silence afterward that has lasted over 300 years. The Mesa remains largely untouched today, its foundations still visible beneath the sagebrush, its story preserved with unusual clarity compared to most Hopi historical accounts. Which leaves a harder question than most. When a community chooses, deliberately and collectively, to destroy part of itself in order to preserve what it believes it truly is, what in the end actually survives? What actually survives in the end is sometimes a question of who is left to remember. Far to the south of the Hopi Mesas, across the floor of the Sonoran Desert near present-day Phoenix, lie the remains of an entirely different kind of civilization. One connected to Hopi history not through direct lineage, but through a relationship far harder to pin down: trade, contact, and possibly alliance with a people who vanished from the archaeological record centuries before Awatovi ever burned. These were the Hohokam, a name derived notably from a Pima word often translated as those who have gone, or all used up, a designation that itself hints at how thoroughly this civilization had already become a mystery to its neighbors by the time outside researchers began asking questions. Between roughly 1 AD and 1450 AD, the Hohokam built one of the most sophisticated irrigation-based societies in pre-contact North America, engineering hundreds of miles of canals across the desert floor to support intensive agriculture, along with ball courts, platform mounds, and trade networks stretching from the Pacific coast to the interior southwest. The Hohokam and the ancestors of the Hopi were, geographically and culturally, distinct peoples. Different language traditions, different architectural styles, different core economic strategies. And yet the archaeological record shows clear evidence of contact between them. Shell ornaments originating from Hohokam trade networks near the Gulf of California have been recovered from ancestral Puebloan sites in the north. Ceramic styles show cross-influence in certain periods. Macaw feathers, likely traded northward through Hohokam intermediaries from Mesoamerica, appear in ceremonial contexts at Puebloan sites, including some associated with early Hopi ancestral communities. This was not casual, incidental contact. It reflects sustained trade relationships maintained over generations. What remains far less certain, and considerably more contested among researchers, is whether this trade relationship extended into something resembling formal alliance, and if so, what such an alliance might have looked like, or why it left so little direct trace in either the archaeological record or in Hopi oral tradition as it has been shared publicly. Some Hopi clan histories do reference southern origins or southern contact more explicitly than others. Certain clans, including some associated with the snake and horn societies, describe migration routes or ceremonial knowledge tied to peoples and places south of the mesas, in terms that some researchers have interpreted as possible references to Hohokam or Hohokam-adjacent communities. These references are rarely explicit by name, given that Hohokam is itself a modern archaeological label rather than a term the people themselves would have used, and given that Hopi oral tradition tends to describe relationships in terms of clan encounters and shared ceremonial knowledge rather than the kind of formal political alliance a historian might recognize. This is where the mystery becomes genuinely difficult to resolve, rather than simply under-researched. The Hohokam civilization went through its own period of significant transformation and apparent decline in the 14th and 15th centuries, roughly overlapping with the broader wave of abandonment affecting Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and other major ancestral Puebloan centers to the north. Some archaeologists have proposed that catastrophic flooding, followed by extended drought, damaged the Hohokam canal systems beyond feasible repair, undermining the agricultural base that had sustained their population for centuries. Others point to evidence of social stress, including signs of conflict and settlement consolidation in the civilization's final generations, suggesting internal fracture may have compounded environmental pressure. Whatever the cause, Hohokam society, as archaeologists define it, effectively ceased to exist as a distinct, unified culture by the mid-15th century, decades before Awatovi's mission was even built, and centuries before Sikyatki's fall. The descendants of the Hohokam are generally understood by most researchers, and by the Owodam and Akimel Owodam peoples themselves, to be the ancestors of these present-day communities of southern Arizona, rather than a population that vanished without trace. In that sense, much like the Hisatsinom, the Hohokam did not disappear so much as transform, their descendants continuing under different names, in different circumstances. But the question of what happened to the specific relationship between Hohokam and early Hopi ancestral communities, whatever that relationship actually was, remains considerably less clear. Did sustained trade and ceremonial exchange constitute something that could reasonably be called alliance, in the sense of mutual obligation or coordinated defense? Or does that word overstate a relationship that was, in reality, closer to opportunistic and periodic trade contact between distinct, unrelated peoples who happen to share a regional trade network? Hopi oral tradition, protective as always of ceremonial specifics, has not offered outside researchers a definitive answer, and what has been shared publicly tends to describe individual clan encounters rather than any broader, formalized relationship between two civilizations. Some researchers have drawn comparisons to other ancient regional trade alliance networks documented elsewhere in the world, commercial and ceremonial partnerships in the ancient Near East and Palestine, for instance, where distinct city-states maintained trade relationships for centuries without ever merging politically or culturally, offering one possible framework for understanding how Hopi ancestral communities and the Hohokam might have coexisted as connected but fundamentally separate peoples. These comparisons remain speculative, offered as useful context rather than direct evidence. What can be said with confidence is that the connection was real, sustained, and significant enough to leave physical traces across hundreds of miles of desert and canyon country. Shells, feathers, ceramics, moving steadily along trade routes for generations. Whether that connection ever rose to the level of formal alliance, and whether its ending was gradual or abrupt, remains genuinely unresolved, buried somewhere between what the canals can still tell us and what the clans have chosen, so far, not to say. So the question remains open, quieter than the others, but no less persistent. If two peoples traded, prayed, and perhaps fought alongside each other for centuries, why does so little of that shared history survive in either the ground or the stories told above it? What the clans have chosen not to say is, in itself, a kind of history. And nowhere is that deliberate silence more pronounced than around one of the most visually striking and least fully explained traditions in Hopi ceremonial life. The practice of the snake priests, keepers of a ritual so distinctive it drew outside fascination for over a century, even as its deepest origins remained carefully guarded. The snake dance, performed historically at several Hopi villages, most famously at Walpi on First Mesa, is among the most documented Hopi ceremonies in the historical record, and also among the most persistently misunderstood. Conducted biennially, alternating with a related flute ceremony, the ritual culminates in a public dance in which members of the snake clan, having spent days gathering live snakes including rattlesnakes from the surrounding desert, carry the animals in their mouths and hands during a ceremonial procession, before releasing them back into the wild in the 4 cardinal directions. The stated purpose, as shared by Hopi participants with outside observers over the decades, centers on rainfall and agricultural fertility. The snakes serving as messengers, carrying prayers for rain down into the earth, where Hopi tradition holds that such prayers are best received. The ceremony's outward drama made it, by the late 19th century, one of the most sought-after spectacles for outside visitors, anthropologists, and photographers traveling to the Southwest. Detailed ethnographic accounts, including extensive documentation by Jesse Walter Fuchs beginning in the 1890s, recorded the ceremony's structure, its associated songs, and its ritual sequence in considerable detail. In this sense, the snake dance is not an obscure or poorly documented tradition. It is, if anything, over-documented by outside observers relative to how much the Hopi themselves chose to explain about its deeper meaning. And that gap, between what was observed and what was understood, is where the real mystery begins. The Snake Clan's own origin story, as shared in fragments across various Hopi accounts, describes a journey undertaken by a Hopi ancestor, sometimes identified as Tio, who traveled down the Colorado River in a hollowed log in search of the source of the waters that sustained Hopi agriculture. During this journey, Tio is said to have encountered the Snake People, an otherworldly society living in an underground kiva who taught him ceremonial knowledge, including the handling of snakes without harm, and who gave him a wife from among their own people. Their descendants, upon returning to Hopi lands, became the Snake Clan, entrusted with the ceremony and its associated knowledge from that point forward. This narrative situates the Snake Clan's origin outside ordinary human history entirely, an encounter with another, non-human society in a location tradition does not specify with geographic precision. Some versions of the account describe the underground kiva as existing near the Grand Canyon. Others leave its location deliberately vague, treating specificity itself as inappropriate for a story understood to operate on a different register than conventional historical memory. What makes this particularly difficult for researchers is that the Snake Clan's practical, verifiable knowledge appears, by any reasonable account, genuinely exceptional. Handling venomous rattlesnakes repeatedly, over days, in close ceremonial contact, without the widespread injury or fatality one might statistically expect, has puzzled outside observers for well over a century. Early ethnographers, including Fuchs, documented what appeared to be specific handling techniques, along with reports, never fully confirmed through rigorous outside scientific study given the ceremony's protected nature, that snakes used in the ritual may be washed or otherwise prepared beforehand in ways that could reduce risk. Hopi practitioners themselves have generally attributed their safety to ceremonial purity and specific traditional knowledge passed down within the clan, rather than to any secular technique they have been willing to fully disclose to outside researchers. This reluctance to explain is not incidental. It reflects a broader pattern across nearly every Hopi tradition discussed here. Knowledge understood as sacred is not treated as information owed to outside curiosity, regardless of how thoroughly that curiosity has been documented by anthropologists eager to record it. The snake priests have allowed their ceremony to be watched, photographed, and extensively described for well over 100 years, while withholding the deeper training, techniques, and spiritual reasoning that make the ceremony possible at all. Whether this reflects genuine specialized knowledge unavailable to outsiders, or ceremonial protocol maintained regardless of practical explanation, is a distinction Hopi tradition has generally not been interested in resolving for external audiences. Some outside researchers, working from a more speculative angle, have proposed that traditions involving specialized, secretive handling of venomous animals in ceremonial contexts appear, in some form, across multiple ancient cultures worldwide. From certain snake handling practices documented in parts of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, including regions of Palestine, to ritual practices recorded in parts of South Asia and West Africa. Whether these represent independently developed traditions responding to a common human relationship with dangerous animals, or something suggesting deeper, harder-to-trace cultural transmission, remains entirely unresolved, and most mainstream scholars favor the former explanation as considerably more plausible than the latter. What is not in dispute is the ceremony's age, its consistency across generations of documented performance, and the specific, closely guarded body of knowledge required to carry it out safely, generation after generation, without the kind of outside scientific verification most researchers would ordinarily expect for a practice this well documented in every other respect. The snake dance itself grew less frequent over the 20th century, performed today by fewer villages and shared even more selectively than in Fuchs's time, as Hopi communities have grown increasingly protective of ceremonies subjected to decades of outside sensationalism. Which leaves the deeper history of the snake priests exactly where the clan itself seems to prefer it. Visible in its outward form, thoroughly photographed and described, and yet, in its essential knowledge, almost entirely unknown beyond those entrusted to carry it. What precisely allows a tradition this dangerous to be practiced this safely for this long? And how much of that answer will the Snake Clan ever choose to share? How much the Snake Clan will ever share remains an open question. But at Oraibi, the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in North America, a different kind of silence surrounds an event that was, by contrast, witnessed in broad daylight, photographed, documented, and argued over ever since, without anyone fully agreeing on what it actually meant. Oraibi sits atop Third Mesa, its stone structures dating back by most archaeological estimates to sometime before 1100 AD, making it older than the founding of most European cities still standing today. For centuries, it stood as one of the largest and most influential Hopi villages, a center of ceremonial authority and population. And then, on a single day in September of 1906, that authority fractured in an event so strange in its specifics that historians still reach for it as a case study in how communities decide, without warfare in the conventional sense, who truly belongs. The immediate cause, as documented by outside observers present at the time, involved a fundamental disagreement over how Oraibi should respond to increasing pressure from American federal authorities. Pressure to accept government schooling, allotment policies, and broader assimilation efforts that had intensified across Hopi lands in the preceding decades. The village had effectively split into two factions, commonly referred to in outside accounts as friendlies, who favored accommodation with federal authority, and hostiles, who opposed it and sought to preserve traditional Hopi governance and ceremonial life without outside interference. Tension between the two factions had been building for years, but by 1906, it reached a breaking point that neither side seemed willing or able to resolve through ordinary negotiation. What happened next has become one of the most vividly remembered moments in Hopi historical memory, precisely because of how deliberately symbolic its resolution was. Rather than resorting to open violence, the two factions are recorded as having agreed to settle the matter through a contest of physical endurance. A pushing match, line against line, the losing side agreeing to leave the village permanently. Village leader Ukioma, representing the traditionalist faction, reportedly drew a line in the dirt and stated that if his group could be pushed across it, they would leave Oraibi for good. The contest proceeded, reportedly lasting under an hour, and the traditionalist faction was pushed back and defeated. True to the agreement, Ukioma and his followers departed Oraibi that same day, eventually founding the village of Hotavila several miles away, while a smaller subsequent split later produced the village of Bakavi as well. On its surface, this is one of the best documented events in Hopi history, precisely dated, witnessed by outside observers including government agents present at the time, and photographed, remarkably, in the moment of the push itself, an image that remains one of the most reproduced photographs in southwestern historical archives. There is no ambiguity about whether this happened. The ambiguity lies entirely in what it actually settled, and why a community with such a long, careful tradition of ceremonial governance chose to resolve so consequential a rupture through what appears, from the outside, to be a strikingly simple physical contest. Some historians have treated the pushing match as exactly what it appears to be, a genuine, if unusual, conflict resolution mechanism, perhaps rooted in older Hopi traditions of settling disputes through contest rather than combat, chosen specifically to prevent the kind of lasting violence and bloodshed that had accompanied earlier village conflicts, including Awatovi's destruction 2 centuries prior. Under this reading, the pushing match represents not primitive simplicity, but a sophisticated cultural mechanism, an agreed-upon binding ritual capable of settling an existential dispute without triggering a cycle of violence and reprisal. Others have suggested the contest's outcome may have been less purely physical than it appeared, proposing that the specific individuals chosen to participate, their positioning, and even the timing of the match may have reflected prior negotiation or ceremonial calculation that outside observers, unfamiliar with Hopi social structure, simply failed to recognize. Under this interpretation, the push itself may have functioned less as the actual mechanism of decision and more as a public ceremonial confirmation of an outcome already understood by both sides beforehand, a performance of resolution rather than resolution itself. There is also a deeper layer to the split that outside accounts have often flattened into a simple binary of progressive versus traditionalist. Hopi oral accounts describe the division at Oraibi as connected, in ways not always made explicit to outside researchers, to older prophecies regarding the eventual fracturing of Hopi society itself. Prophecies some elders have connected to the broader sequence of signs associated with the Blue Star tradition discussed earlier in this exploration. Under this reading, the 1906 split was not simply a political disagreement over federal policy, but the fulfillment, however unexpected in its specific form, of a much older expectation that Hopi unity would eventually be tested and divided from within, long before any external sign might resolve it. Comparative historians have noted that societies fracturing under external colonial or religious pressure often produce founding myths around the specific moment of division, origin stories for new communities, not unlike foundational splits documented in other cultures under comparable pressure, from post-colonial societies worldwide to ancient tribal divisions recorded in ancient Near Eastern and Palestine historical traditions. Whether the Oraibi split deserves this kind of comparative framing, or whether it should be understood on its own specific terms, within Hopi social and prophetic tradition alone, remains a matter of ongoing scholarly disagreement. What remains certain is the photograph, the line in the dirt, and the fact that Oraibi, once the largest and arguably most influential Hopi village, never fully recovered its former population or centrality after that September afternoon. 3 villages exist today where one stood before. Whether that division represented failure, wisdom, prophecy fulfilled, or some combination the participants themselves could not have fully articulated even as it happened, is a question Hopi communities continue to hold with considerably more complexity than outside history has generally allowed. So the line in the dirt remains, symbolically if not literally, a reminder that some of the most consequential mysteries are not the ones hidden from view, but the ones witnessed in full and still not entirely understood. Some things, witnessed in full, are still not entirely understood. But the story of the Bear Clan asks something different of anyone trying to trace it. Not because its central event was witnessed and debated, but because the event itself, a migration spanning generations and, according to tradition, much of a continent, left behind only fragments. A name, a handful of place references, and a claim of primacy that every other Hopi clan has historically accepted without serious dispute. Among the Hopi clans, the Bear Clan, Honyam, holds a distinct position. Hopi tradition consistently identifies the Bear Clan as the first to arrive at the site of Oraibi, and by extension, as the clan credited with founding the village itself and establishing the framework of leadership that later clans, arriving in subsequent waves of migration, would settle into upon their own arrival. This is not a minor detail. Hopi social and ceremonial structure is organized substantially around clan seniority, determined by order of arrival, and the Bear Clan's foundational status has shaped village governance, land allocation, and ceremonial responsibility for the better part of 1,000 years. And yet the specific migration that brought the Bear Clan to Oraibi is, paradoxically, one of the least geographically precise of all Hopi clan histories, despite being among the most consequential. Hopi clan migration traditions as a category tend to follow a recognizable pattern. Extended journeys undertaken over generations, often described as spiraling outward toward the 4 cardinal directions before eventually turning back toward the mesas, with specific ruins, landmarks, and place names cited along the way as evidence of passage. Several clans describe migration routes that correspond, at least loosely, with archaeologically verified ancestral sites, lending those particular oral histories a degree of external corroboration. The Bear Clan's migration, by contrast, is described in broader, less specific terms across most published accounts. References to journeys from the south, sometimes associated with regions well beyond the immediate southwest, without the same density of specific checkable landmarks that characterize other clan histories. This vagueness has invited 2 very different kinds of explanation, neither of which can currently be confirmed or ruled out with the available evidence. The more conventional explanation, favored by most anthropologists who have studied Hopi clan structure, holds that the Bear Clan's migration account has simply been worn smoother by time than other clan histories, precisely because of its antiquity and its foundational status. As the first clan to arrive, its journey would have been the oldest story in the sequence, told and retold across more generations than any other, with specific geographic details naturally eroding through that extended process of oral transmission in a way that later, more recently arrived, clans' histories have not yet experienced to the same degree. Under this reading, the Bear Clan's migration is not mysterious, so much as simply old. Old enough that the specific texture of the journey has given way, over centuries, to a more condensed symbolic account, retaining the fact of long-distance travel and southern origin while losing the granular detail a modern researcher might wish for. A second explanation, offered more cautiously by some ethnographers and Hopi commentators alike, proposes that the vagueness is not an accident of erosion, but a matter of ceremonial discretion. Under this view, the Bear Clan's specific migration route, precisely because of its foundational importance to Hopi governance and ceremonial authority, may be considered too significant, too tied to leadership legitimacy, to share in full detail with outside researchers, regardless of how thoroughly other clan histories have been documented. If accurate, this would mean the vagueness outside audiences encounter is not the full picture at all, but a deliberately incomplete version of a story whose complete form remains carefully restricted within specific ceremonial and genealogical lines, not unlike the guarded knowledge associated with the sacred tablets discussed earlier in this exploration. Archaeology offers partial, frustratingly inconclusive assistance here. Southern migration accounts broadly align with the well-documented northward spread of maize agriculture, ceramic technology, and certain architectural styles from Mesoamerica into the American Southwest over the preceding centuries and millennia, a slow diffusion process archaeologists can trace with reasonable confidence through material culture alone, independent of any specific clan narrative. In that broad sense, a southern origin for the Bear Clan, or for Hopi ancestral populations more generally, is entirely consistent with the archaeological record. But broad consistency is not the same as specific confirmation. No excavated site has been definitively linked to the Bear Clan's migration in the way certain sites have been more confidently associated with other clans' more geographically detailed accounts. This gap has, predictably, attracted more speculative attention than most other Hopi historical questions, given how foundational the Bear Clan's status makes its story. Some fringe researchers have proposed considerably more distant points of origin, extending the Bear Clan's journey beyond Mesoamerica entirely, into speculative territories involving transoceanic contact or even more far-reaching diffusionist theories connecting southwestern indigenous origins to ancient civilizations across the Pacific, or, in some of the more expansive comparative frameworks, to migration and clan-based leadership traditions documented in the ancient Near East and Palestine, where seniority of arrival similarly conferred foundational tribal authority in certain historical traditions. These comparisons remain almost entirely speculative, unsupported by genetic, linguistic, or archaeological evidence connecting Hopi ancestral populations to sources beyond the Americas, and most serious researchers treat them as interesting structural parallels at most, rather than evidence of shared origin. What can be said with confidence, grounded in both oral tradition and the broader archaeological record, is this. The Bear Clan's claim to primacy at Oraibi has gone essentially unchallenged by other Hopi clans for as long as outside researchers have been documenting Hopi social structure, suggesting a foundational story with deep, stable roots, regardless of how much specific geographic detail has survived alongside it. Clan seniority in Hopi society is not merely honorary. It carries real ceremonial and governance responsibility, allocated according to an order of arrival that the Bear Clan has occupied, without serious internal dispute, for the entire span of recorded Hopi history. That stability is itself worth sitting with. A founding claim this consequential, if it were seriously contested or historically dubious, might reasonably be expected to generate rival traditions, competing narratives, or at least periodic challenge from clans with reason to dispute it. None of that appears in the historical or ethnographic record. Whatever the full route of the Bear Clan's migration actually was, whatever specific landscape it crossed on its way north from wherever it truly began, the destination it eventually claimed has never seriously been questioned by those who arrived after. Which leaves the deeper puzzle exactly where the story itself leaves it. A journey whose ending is certain, inscribed into the very structure of a village that still stands, and whose beginning remains somewhere out there, past the edge of what any surviving account, oral or archaeological, has yet been willing or able to fully retrace. A beginning past the edge of what any account can retrace is, in its own way, a fitting place to arrive at the clan whose knowledge sits closest to the center of everything discussed so far. If the Bear Clan claims the deepest roots in Oraibi soil, it is the Fire Clan, Kokop, whose members are understood to carry the deepest roots in Hopi cosmology itself. Custodians of ceremonial knowledge so foundational that other traditions across this exploration, from the sacred tablets to the Blue Star prophecy, ultimately trace back to what the Fire Clan is said to hold. The Fire Clan's association with the sacred tablets has already been discussed, but that guardianship represents only one piece of a considerably larger body of responsibility. Hopi tradition identifies the Fire Clan as central to the Wuwachim ceremony, one of the 4 major ceremonies in the Hopi ritual calendar, and, by most accounts, the most esoteric and least publicly documented of them all. Unlike the snake dance, which drew ethnographers and photographers by the dozens beginning in the late 19th century, Wuwachim has remained comparatively shielded from outside observation, conducted primarily at night, restricted largely to initiated men, and built around themes considered too foundational, too close to the core of Hopi cosmology, to be shared openly with audiences outside the ceremonial structure itself. What outside researchers do know about Wuwachim comes largely through limited, carefully negotiated ethnographic access, most notably documented by anthropologist Misha Titiev in the 1930s and 1940s, whose accounts remain among the most detailed available, though even Titiev's records are understood by scholars to represent only a partial picture, shaped by what Hopi participants were willing to disclose. The ceremony is associated with themes of creation, emergence, and the establishment of the social and ceremonial order that governs Hopi life to this day. Effectively, a ritual reenactment or reaffirmation of the emergent story itself, conducted by the very clan tradition credits with carrying the deepest memory of that original event. This positions the Fire Clan in a genuinely unusual role among Hopi society. Where the Bear Clan holds primacy in matters of village governance and land, the Fire Clan holds something more difficult to categorize, a kind of cosmological seniority tied not to order of arrival at a specific place, but to proximity to origin itself. Multiple Hopi accounts describe the Fire Clan as having been present, in some form, from the very beginning of the emergence narrative, carrying knowledge that predates even the physical act of migration undertaken by other clans. Whether this reflects an actual historical claim to earlier presence or a ceremonial framework describing spiritual rather than literal precedents, is a distinction Hopi tradition itself does not always draw sharply, and outside researchers have generally been cautious about imposing that distinction where Hopi accounts do not make it explicit. The clan's association with fire itself deepens the puzzle rather than simplifying it. Fire, in Hopi ceremonial context, is understood as more than a practical tool. It appears across multiple traditions discussed in this exploration as a marker of transition and purification, closely related conceptually to the very purification associated with the Blue Star prophecy's anticipated fulfillment. Some Hopi accounts describe the Fire Clan as having been entrusted, at the time of emergence, with specific responsibility for maintaining ceremonial fire and the knowledge required to use it correctly within ritual context. Knowledge understood to be considerably more complex and consequential than simple firecraft, tied instead to timing, purification, and the correct maintenance of ceremonial order across the full ritual calendar. Archaeologically, evidence of specialized fire-related ceremonial practice among ancestral Puebloan and early Hopi communities is genuinely well documented. Excavated kiva sites across the southwest, including at Awatovi and other major settlements discussed earlier in this exploration, show evidence of carefully maintained ceremonial hearths, distinct from ordinary domestic fire use, suggesting specialized ritual practice around fire extending back many centuries, well before any outside documentation existed to record its meaning. This lends a degree of material grounding to what might otherwise read as purely symbolic tradition. The practice, at minimum, is old, consistent, and archaeologically verifiable, even where its full ceremonial meaning remains understood only within the clan itself. What makes the Fire Clan's knowledge particularly difficult to assess from the outside is the degree to which it appears to function as a kind of connective tissue running through nearly every other mystery already discussed. The sacred tablets, entrusted to Fire Clan keeping. The Wuwuchim ceremony, reaffirming the emergence narrative underlying the Sipapu tradition. The purification theme running through the Blue Star prophecy, echoing the purificatory role fire itself plays in ceremonial context. Even the division at Oraibi in 1906 carries a Fire Clan dimension rarely emphasized in outside accounts. Given the clan's historical association with village leadership structures, the split ultimately fractured. Rather than representing an isolated body of specialized knowledge, the Fire Clan's tradition appears to sit at the intersection of nearly every thread this exploration has traced so far, suggesting either a genuinely unified cosmological system maintained with remarkable consistency across centuries, or, as some more skeptical researchers have proposed, a retrospective narrative coherence imposed by the very people responsible for preserving and interpreting these traditions for outside audiences, whether consciously or not. Comparative researchers, working from a more speculative angle, have occasionally noted structural similarities between the Fire Clan's role and priestly lineages documented in other ancient societies responsible for maintaining sacred fire, calendar knowledge, and ceremonial timing. From fire-keeping traditions recorded in ancient Mesoamerica to ritual fire practices described in parts of the ancient Near East and Palestine, where specific priestly families similarly held responsibility for maintaining sacred flame and its associated calendrical knowledge across generations. As with earlier comparisons in this exploration, most mainstream scholars regard these as interesting structural parallels reflecting common human ceremonial logic rather than evidence of any direct historical connection between unrelated cultures separated by vast distance and time. What remains beyond serious dispute is the Fire Clan's centrality to Hopi ceremonial life, a centrality reflected consistently across generations of both Hopi self-description and outside ethnographic observation, however incomplete that observation has necessarily remained. The clan's knowledge has proven remarkably durable, surviving colonization, missionization, forced schooling, and the sustained curiosity of outside researchers for well over a century, without ever being fully disclosed beyond its intended ceremonial context. Whether that durability reflects the genuine antiquity and coherence of the knowledge itself, or simply the discipline and consistency with which the Fire Clan has guarded it, may be a distinction without a meaningful difference from the outside looking in. What can be said is this. At the center of nearly every Hopi mystery this exploration has traced, the Fire Clan's presence reappears, quietly, insistently, as though every thread eventually leads back to the same source. The only remaining question is how much of that source has ever actually been seen, and how much continues to burn, deliberately unseen, exactly where it was always meant to remain. Exactly where it was always meant to remain. That phrase could describe the Fire Clan's knowledge, but it applies with equal force to a related tradition, one bound to the Fire Clan by ceremonial partnership rather than shared lineage. The Horn Society, whose origins remain even among specialists in Hopi ceremonial structure, one of the more genuinely unresolved questions in the entire system. The Horn Society, known in Hopi as Al, occupies a distinctive position within the Wuwuchim ceremonial complex discussed in the previous section. Where the Fire Clan carries primary responsibility for the ceremony's deepest cosmological content, the Horn Society functions as one of several ceremonial societies participating alongside it, associated in Hopi tradition with hunting knowledge, animal relationships, and a body of ritual practice connecting human communities to the deer, antelope, and mountain sheep whose horns give the society its name and, according to tradition, much of its symbolic authority. What makes the Horn Society's origin genuinely difficult to trace, even by the standards already established across this exploration, is the near-total absence of a clear migration narrative comparable to those associated with other clans and societies. Where the Bear Clan's journey, however vague in its geographic specifics, is at least framed as a migration from a southern point of origin, and where the Fire Clan's authority is framed as cosmological rather than geographic, The Horned Society's origin story, as shared across available ethnographic accounts, resists even this level of categorization. Some versions describe the society as having existed already, in some form, among the peoples the Hopi encountered upon arrival at the Mesas, suggesting the Horned Society's knowledge may not be Hopi in origin at all, but rather adopted or absorbed from an earlier population already present in the region before Hopi ancestral clans completed their migrations. This possibility, if accurate, would place the Horned Society in a genuinely distinct category among Hopi ceremonial traditions, not a body of knowledge carried forward from emergence, as the Fire Clan's tradition claims, and not knowledge developed during the long migration process, as most other clan traditions describe, but knowledge encountered and incorporated locally from a population whose own identity and fate remain almost entirely unaddressed in the historical and archaeological record available to outside researchers. Archaeology offers a genuinely intriguing, if inconclusive, point of contact here. The ancestral Puebloan record across the Colorado Plateau includes evidence of earlier, more diffuse hunting and gathering populations predating the sustained agricultural settlements associated with the Hisatsinom migrations discussed earlier in this exploration. Populations sometimes referred to by archaeologists using the broader, imprecise label of desert archaic cultures, present in the region for thousands of years before the emergence of the settled village societies more directly ancestral to the Hopi. Rock art sites across the southwest, some dated to periods well before 1 AD, depict hunting scenes, animal imagery, and figures bearing horns or antlers in ways some researchers have proposed may represent early ceremonial or symbolic precursors to practices later formalized within traditions like the Horned Society. Whether any direct continuity connects these ancient rock art traditions to the specific ceremonial practices of the historical Horned Society remains entirely unconfirmed, resting on visual similarity and rough chronological plausibility rather than any demonstrated unbroken transmission. This uncertainty has not stopped outside researchers, and some Hopi commentators themselves, from proposing more specific frameworks for understanding the Horned Society's likely origin. One relatively mainstream interpretation holds that the Horned Society represents a formalized, ceremonially integrated version of hunting knowledge and animal relationship practices, genuinely older than settled Hopi village life itself. Practices that predate agriculture, predate the emergence narrative's formal structure, and were incorporated into the broader Wuwachim ceremonial complex specifically because hunting remained ecologically essential, even after agriculture became the Hopi's primary subsistence strategy. Under this reading, the Horned Society is not mysterious in its content so much as in its chronology, representing a genuinely ancient layer of practice folded into a ceremonial system that otherwise organizes itself around the comparatively more recent framework of clan migration and emergence. A more speculative line of interpretation, offered cautiously by some researchers working at the edges of mainstream southwestern archaeology, proposes that the Horned Society's absorbed or adopted origin may reflect actual historical contact between early Hopi ancestral clans and a genuinely distinct earlier population. Not simply older knowledge developed by the same continuous lineage, but knowledge and practice belonging originally to a separate people, later incorporated through some combination of alliance, intermarriage, or absorption whose specific historical circumstances have been lost entirely to time. If accurate, this would mean the Horned Society preserves not simply old Hopi knowledge, but knowledge belonging, in its deepest origin, to people who were never Hopi at all. A population whose identity, language, and ultimate fate remain unaddressed by any surviving account, Hopi or archaeological. This question connects in ways worth sitting with carefully to broader patterns already traced across this exploration. The Hisatsinom migrations discussed earlier describe population movement and consolidation across the 13th century, but say comparatively little about what happened to any earlier, pre-agricultural populations already present in the region before those migrations began. If such populations existed in meaningful numbers, as the archaeological record of earlier desert archaic occupation suggests they did, their absorption into arriving agricultural societies, rather than their disappearance or displacement, would represent an entirely plausible historical outcome. one the Horn Society's uncertain origin may, in fact, preserve a genuine institutional memory of, however faint that memory has become across the centuries since. Some comparative researchers have noted broadly similar patterns in other regions where agricultural or settled societies absorbed earlier hunting populations and their associated ceremonial knowledge, from documented cases across Mesoamerica to similar patterns proposed with varying degrees of scholarly acceptance in the ancient Near East and Palestine, where pastoral and hunting traditions are understood by some historians to have persisted within and been formally incorporated into later agricultural and urban societies, rather than being fully displaced by them. These comparisons remain structural rather than evidentiary, offered as plausible context for a pattern that appears, in broad strokes, across multiple unrelated regions of the ancient world. What can be said with confidence is considerably more modest than what the speculation might suggest. The Horn Society's ceremonial role within Wuwachim is well documented. Its association with hunting knowledge and human-animal relationship is consistent across available accounts. And its origin, uniquely among the major traditions discussed in this exploration, resists confident placement within either the emergence narrative or the clan migration framework that organizes nearly every other piece of Hopi historical memory, which leaves a question this exploration has now circled from several different directions, each time finding a slightly different shape to the same underlying uncertainty. How much of what the Hopi carry today was carried the entire distance from emergence itself, and how much was gathered, absorbed, or inherited along the way from peoples whose own story may never be fully recovered. Whether that story may ever be fully recovered is a question that returns, in an entirely different form, at the ruins scattered along the Little Colorado River, where a clan whose very name means water once built its earliest settlements in a landscape that, for most of the year, offers barely enough of it to survive. The Patki, or Water Clan, holds a position of particular importance within Hopi social and ceremonial structure, associated closely with rain, fertility, and the Palulukang or horned water serpent tradition central to several major ceremonies, including elements of the snake antelope ceremonial complex discussed earlier in this exploration. Hopi tradition identifies the Patki clan as having migrated from the south, following a route broadly consistent with the general southern origin pattern shared by several major clans, including the Bear clan, though the Patki migration account includes a level of specific place-based detail that the Bear clan's history, by comparison, largely lacks. Multiple Hopi accounts describe the Patki clan's migration as passing through, and in some cases settling for extended periods at, sites along the Little Colorado River and its tributaries, before eventually continuing north toward the mesas. Some of these accounts specifically identify ruins in the Homolovi area, near present-day Winslow, Arizona, as former Patki settlements, a claim that carries unusually strong archaeological corroboration compared to many other clan migration traditions discussed across this exploration. The Homolovi sites, now preserved as Homolovi State Park, represent a genuinely well-documented cluster of ancestral Puebloan settlements occupied primarily between the 13th and 15th centuries, a period that aligns closely with the broader wave of Hisatsinom migration and consolidation discussed earlier. Archaeological excavation at Homolovi has recovered ceramics, architectural evidence, and settlement patterns consistent with populations practicing intensive floodplain agriculture along the Little Colorado, exploiting the river's seasonal flooding to support crops in an otherwise arid landscape. Contemporary Hopi communities maintain active cultural and ceremonial connections to Homolovi, and the site's designation as a protected state park was itself substantially shaped by Hopi advocacy, specifically because of its recognized ancestral significance. In this sense, the broad outline of the Patki clan's migration through the Homolovi region is about as well corroborated as any clan history examined in this exploration, resting on a rare convergence of oral tradition, sustained cultural continuity, and direct archaeological evidence. This makes what remains unexplained about the Patki clan's earliest settlements considerably more puzzling than it might otherwise be, precisely because so much of the surrounding picture is unusually clear. The specific mystery centers on the apparent abandonment pattern at Homolovi itself, which differs in important respects from the abandonment patterns already discussed at other major sites across this exploration. Unlike Chaco Canyon or Mesa Verde, where drought and resource depletion offer a broadly satisfying explanation for large-scale departure, and unlike Sikyatki, where oral tradition points toward violent conflict, the Homolovi sites show evidence of a more prolonged cyclical pattern of occupation, abandonment, and in some cases apparent reoccupation, extending across multiple generations before final departure sometime in the 15th century. Tree ring and archaeological evidence suggest the Little Colorado's floodplain agriculture was subject to unusually severe and unpredictable variation, with the river's flow shifting dramatically across shorter timescales than the broader regional drought patterns typically cited for other Hisatsinom sites. This raises a specific question that most mainstream archaeological explanations have not fully resolved. Why would a clan specifically associated with water, rain, and the ceremonial knowledge required to negotiate humanity's relationship with unpredictable water sources settle repeatedly in one of the most hydrologically volatile locations available to them rather than a more stable water source elsewhere in the region? Some archaeologists have proposed a relatively practical answer, suggesting that the very unpredictability of the Little Colorado may have been precisely what necessitated the kind of specialized ceremonial and practical water management knowledge the Patki clan is remembered as having developed and carried forward, that the clan's defining expertise emerged specifically because the environment demanded it, rather than despite that demand. A different, more speculative line of interpretation, offered by some Hopi commentators and outside researchers examining the clan's ceremonial content more closely, proposes that the repeated cycle of settlement and abandonment at Homolovi may not represent simple failed adaptation to a difficult environment, but something closer to deliberate, cyclical ceremonial practice. Periods of habitation and departure tied to ritual calendar considerations, drought response protocols embedded within Patki ceremonial knowledge itself, rather than purely reactive environmental adaptation. Under this reading, what appears in the archaeological record as repeated failure and reoccupation might instead reflect a genuinely sophisticated, if difficult to fully reconstruct, water management strategy operating on a longer timescale than conventional archaeological interpretation typically assumes for a single, continuously occupied agricultural settlement. Neither interpretation can currently be confirmed with the available evidence, and the distinction matters considerably for how the site's ultimate abandonment is understood. If the cyclical pattern reflects genuine ceremonial strategy, then Homolovi's final abandonment in the 15th century would represent a specific, presumably significant break from an established, functioning pattern, raising the question of what precisely changed severely enough to end a strategy that had apparently sustained the community across multiple previous cycles of hardship. If, instead, the pattern reflects ordinary environmental struggle without deeper ceremonial coordination, the final abandonment requires no special explanation beyond the broader regional drought pressures already well documented across this period. Hopi oral tradition, as shared publicly, generally frames the departure from Homolovi in terms consistent with the broader migration narrative discussed throughout this exploration. Clans moving onward as part of a larger spiritually mandated journey toward the mesas, rather than a departure forced purely by environmental failure. This framing does not necessarily contradict the archaeological evidence of hydrological instability, but it does resist reducing the departure to simple environmental defeat, situating it instead within the same broader covenant structure that governs how Hopi tradition understands nearly every major migration discussed across this exploration. Comparative researchers have occasionally noted broader parallels between water clan traditions and cyclical settlement patterns tied to unpredictable river systems in other ancient agricultural societies, from Nile-adjacent settlement patterns in ancient Egypt to seasonal and drought cycle agricultural practices documented across the ancient Near East and Palestine, where communities similarly develop specialized ceremonial and practical knowledge specifically oriented around managing unpredictable water sources central to their survival. As with earlier comparative observations throughout this exploration, these parallels remain structural rather than evidentiary, offered as context for a pattern that recurs, in broad form, wherever settled agricultural societies have depended on volatile water sources for their survival. What remains firmly established is the Patki clan's deep, well-documented connection to the Homolovi sites, a connection strong enough to have directly shaped the modern preservation and interpretation of the ruins themselves. What remains genuinely uncertain is whether the repeated cycle of habitation and departure recorded in the ground reflects a community struggling against an unforgiving river, or a community that had, in fact, learned to work within that river's unpredictability far more deliberately than the archaeological record alone can currently prove. Which leaves the ruins along the Little Colorado holding a question distinct from nearly every other site examined so far. Not simply why a settlement ended, but whether its repeated endings and returns were themselves the strategy all along. And if so, what finally made the river, or the clan's relationship to it, impossible to sustain any longer. What finally made the river impossible to sustain is a question the ground may never fully answer. But threaded through nearly every account examined so far, the Bear clan's primacy at Oraibi, the Fire clan's cosmological seniority, the Patki clan's specific corroborated migration, sits a deeper, largely unspoken tension that this exploration has, until now, moved around rather than through. Hopi tradition does not actually agree on what first means, and depending on which framework is used, several different clans can reasonably claim the title. This is not, it should be said clearly, a dispute in the sense of active contemporary disagreement. Hopi villages have, by all available accounts, maintained a functional, broadly accepted social order around clan seniority for as long as outside researchers have documented it, and nothing in this section should be read as suggesting genuine unresolved conflict among Hopi communities today. The tension instead lives at a more structural level, visible primarily to outside researchers attempting to reconcile the different, not entirely compatible ways Hopi tradition itself defines priority. The Bear clan's claim, as discussed earlier in this exploration, rests on order of arrival at a specific place. Oraibi. This is a geographically and socially concrete claim, tied to the founding of a particular village and the governance structure that followed from it. It is not, however, a claim about which clan emerged first from the Sipapu, or which clan's ancestors were first to begin the migration process described throughout Hopi oral tradition, more broadly. Several other Hopi villages besides Oraibi were founded independently, by different clans arriving in different orders, meaning first at Oraibi and first out of emergence are not, strictly speaking, the same question, even though outside summaries of Hopi history have often collapsed them into a single, simplified narrative for the sake of clarity. The Fire clan's claim, discussed in the preceding section, operates on an entirely different axis altogether. Not order of arrival at any specific location, but proximity to the emergence event itself, a claim rooted in cosmological rather than geographic priority. Some Hopi accounts describe the Fire clan as having existed, in some meaningful sense, from the very beginning of the emergence narrative, predating even the concept of migration as other clans experienced it. If taken literally, this would make the Fire clan first, in a sense entirely distinct from, and potentially senior to, the Bear clan's geographic primacy at Oraibi specifically. And then there is a third category of claim, harder to locate within any single clan tradition, but present nonetheless across various Hopi accounts. The idea that the very first people to emerge from the Sipapu were not organized into the clan structure recognized today at all, but existed in the earliest phase of the Fourth World as an undifferentiated community, with clan identity itself emerging only later, as different family groups develop distinct relationships with specific animals, natural forces, or ceremonial responsibilities during the long migration process that followed. Under this reading, asking which clan was first may be, in a strict sense, an unanswerable question, because clan identity as currently understood may postdate emergence itself by an uncertain but potentially significant span of time. This layered, sometimes contradictory structure has understandably generated considerable outside scholarly interest, particularly among anthropologists working to reconcile Hopi oral tradition with the broader archaeological timeline of ancestral Puebloan settlement across the Southwest. Most contemporary researchers studying Hopi social structure have concluded that these differing claims are not, in fact, competing answers to the same question, but rather reflect genuinely different, coexisting frameworks of seniority operating simultaneously within Hopi society: geographic, cosmological, and temporal priority, each governing different aspects of social and ceremonial authority without requiring reconciliation into a single hierarchy. Under this interpretation, the apparent contradiction is a misreading imposed by outside observers expecting a single linear hierarchy, where Hopi tradition has never actually required one. A more speculative line of inquiry, pursued by some researchers working closer to the edges of mainstream anthropology, has proposed that the layered, seemingly contradictory nature of Hopi firstness claims may itself preserve genuine historical information about how Hopi society actually formed, not through a single unified migration completed by an already organized set of clans, but through the gradual convergence, over centuries, of multiple distinct population groups, each carrying its own origin account, which were later woven together into the more unified emergence narrative recognized today. Under this reading, the coexistence of geographic, cosmological, and temporal claims to primacy would reflect the genuine complexity of Hopi ethnogenesis itself, a society formed not from a single point of origin, but from the deliberate, careful integration of several, whose distinct claims to first were never fully reconciled because they originally belonged to different groups with different stories, rather than to a single people whose story simply grew more elaborate with retelling. This more speculative framework finds partial, indirect support in the broader patterns already traced across this exploration. The Horn Society's likely absorption of pre-agricultural ceremonial knowledge, the Hisatsinom migrations converging from multiple directions toward the mesas, and the general archaeological consensus that Hopi ethnogenesis, like that of most Puebloan peoples, likely involve the consolidation of multiple distinct population groups over an extended period, rather than a single point of origin followed by simple linear expansion. Comparative anthropologists have noted similar layered origin structures in other societies formed through the convergence of multiple population groups, from various indigenous nations across North America to ancient confederations documented in the Near East and Palestine, where founding narratives similarly preserve multiple, not entirely reconciled claims to primacy among constituent tribes or clans, reflecting genuine historical complexity rather than simple narrative inconsistency. What can be said with confidence, and what perhaps matters more than resolving the question definitively, is that Hopi society itself has functioned, for as long as it has been documented, without requiring a single answer to this question. The coexistence of the Bear Clan's geographic primacy, the Fire Clan's cosmological seniority, and the deeper, less clearly attributed possibility of a pre-clan emergent community has not undermined Hopi social cohesion. If anything, it may reflect a form of historical honesty rarely matched by traditions elsewhere that insist on tidier, more linear founding narratives, an acknowledgement, built into the very structure of the tradition, that origins are rarely as simple as a single first arrival. Which leaves this exploration's central question in its most distilled form. Is there truly a single first Hopi clan waiting to be identified, if only enough fragments could be gathered and compared? Or has Hopi tradition, in its layered, deliberately unresolved structure, been quietly telling us all along that the search for a single beginning may be the wrong question entirely? Perhaps the search for a single beginning is the wrong question. But somewhere above the mesas, circling on updrafts few humans will ever fully understand, flies a creature whose relationship with the Hopi predates written record and whose clan's own journey to the villages remains, even by the standards already set across this exploration, unusually difficult to place on any map. The Eagle Clan, Kwangyam, occupies a position within Hopi society that is at once highly visible and strangely under-examined. Visible because eagles themselves are central to some of the most widely known and outwardly observable elements of Hopi ceremonial life. The annual eagle gathering expeditions, the careful raising of young eagles captured from nests on the mesas and surrounding cliffs, and the ceremonies culminating each summer in the ritual release of the eagle's spirits, an event outside observers have documented with varying degrees of understanding for well over a century. under-examined, because despite this outward visibility, the specific migration history that brought the Eagle clan itself to the Mesas remains one of the least consistently documented among the major clan traditions this exploration has traced. This is, on its face, a strange imbalance. Clans with far less prominent ceremonial visibility, the Patki clan among them, have migration accounts corroborated by specific excavated sites and consistent oral detail. The Eagle clan, whose ceremonial role is arguably more visible to outsiders than almost any other, presents a migration history that shifts noticeably depending on which ethnographic source and which era of documentation a researcher consults. Some accounts, recorded primarily in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by ethnographers including Fuchs and later researchers building on his work, describe the Eagle clan as closely related to, or in some tellings, a branch of the Bear clan, sharing elements of the same broad migration tradition from the south before separating at some point prior to arrival at the Mesas. Other accounts, recorded from different informants or different villages, describe the Eagle clan's origin as entirely distinct, associated instead with a migration route bringing the clan into contact, and eventually alliance, with mountain-dwelling peoples to the north or northeast of Hopi territory, in the general direction of what is now the Four Corners region. A third set of accounts, considerably less common but present in the ethnographic record nonetheless, describes the Eagle clan's origin in more explicitly non-human terms, framing the clan's earliest ancestors as having descended not from ordinary human migrants at all, but from a direct ancestral relationship with eagles themselves, a lineage the clan's human descendants inherited rather than simply adopted through later ceremonial specialization. These are not minor variations on a single core story, of the kind that might be expected across different tellings of the same underlying tradition. They represent, in outside academic terms, three meaningfully different origin frameworks, coexisting within the broader body of material outside researchers have gathered under the single label of Eagle clan history, without any clear consensus, even among Hopi communities themselves as represented in the available published record, as to which framework should be considered primary. Several explanations have been proposed for this unusual degree of variation, none of which fully resolves the underlying puzzle. The most straightforward explanation, favored by many anthropologists working within a conventional framework, holds that the variation simply reflects the genuinely decentralized nature of Hopi clan tradition itself. Different villages and different informants within those villages have historically maintained somewhat different versions of shared traditions, shaped by local ceremonial context, specific lineage history within a given village, and the particular relationship a given branch of a clan maintained with the broader clan tradition as a whole. Under this reading, the Eagle clan's varied origin accounts are not evidence of a deeper mystery so much as an ordinary consequence of documenting an oral tradition across multiple villages and multiple generations of outside ethnographic contact. Each interview capturing a locally specific variant rather than a single, authoritative account that outside researchers have simply failed to properly synthesize. A second explanation, offered by researchers paying closer attention to the specific ceremonial content associated with eagle gathering practices, proposes that the variation may reflect the Eagle clan's genuinely composite historical origin, similar in structure to the broader pattern of Hopi ethnogenesis discussed in the preceding section. Under this reading, what is documented today as a single Eagle clan may, in fact, represent the historical merger of separate lineages, each originally holding a distinct relationship with eagles, whether through direct migration alongside the Bear clan, through alliance with northern mountain peoples, or through older, more localized traditions of eagle reverence predating organized clan migration altogether. If accurate, the Eagle clan, as documented by outside researchers, would not represent a single lineage with a single migration history at all, but a later ceremonial consolidation of multiple, originally distinct groups united by their shared relationship with the same bird, their individually distinct origin stories surviving today as apparent inconsistency rather than as clearly labeled separate historical strands. This possibility gains a degree of circumstantial support from the practical structure of eagle gathering itself. a practice that, unlike many other Hopi ceremonial traditions discussed across this exploration, appears to have required, and continues to require, cooperation across village and even clan boundaries. Eagle nesting sites are limited in number and distributed unevenly across the mesas and surrounding cliffs, meaning access has historically depended on negotiated relationships between specific families and specific nesting territories. Relationships that, by some accounts, have occasionally crossed clan lines in ways not entirely typical of other Hopi ceremonial responsibilities. A tradition built around this kind of negotiated cross-cutting access to a scarce natural resource might plausibly generate exactly the kind of layered, locally variable origin account the ethnographic record actually shows. A third, more speculative line of interpretation returns to the third category of origin account mentioned earlier, the tradition framing the Eagle clan's earliest ancestors as descended directly from eagles, rather than simply associated with them through later ceremonial practice. Taken literally, this account resists straightforward historical or archaeological verification in the way migration routes involving human movement across identifiable landscape can, at least in principle, be traced. Some researchers examining this tradition alongside broader patterns in southwestern indigenous cosmology have proposed that accounts of this kind, describing direct ancestral descent from a specific animal rather than simple totemic association, may preserve genuine information about extremely early human-animal relationships from a period predating the kind of clan-based social organization that later traditions, including most other Hopi clan histories, more clearly describe. Under this reading, the Eagle clan's non-human origin account would not represent embellishment or metaphor layered onto an otherwise ordinary migration story, but a genuinely older category of tradition, surviving from a period when the boundary Hopi society later drew between human clan ancestry and animal ceremonial relationship had not yet been as clearly established as it became in later tradition. Archaeological evidence offers only indirect support for any of these frameworks. Eagle remains, including carefully interred eagle burials showing evidence of ceremonial treatment, have been recovered from ancestral Puebloan sites across the Southwest dating back many centuries, confirming that eagle reverence and ceremonial practice extend well back into the pre-contact period, considerably predating the earliest outside ethnographic documentation of Hopi eagle gatherings specifically. This confirms the practice's genuine antiquity without resolving which of the competing origin frameworks, if any, most accurately describes how that ancient practice came to be specifically associated with the lineage outside researchers now document as the Eagle clan. Comparative researchers, working in the same speculative register that has appeared throughout this exploration, have occasionally noted that traditions describing direct ancestral descent from a specific bird or animal, rather than simple totemic reverence, appear across numerous unrelated cultures worldwide, from various Mesoamerican eagle warrior traditions to bird ancestor myths documented among cultures on nearly every inhabited continent, including certain avian ancestral traditions recorded in parts of the ancient Near East and Palestine, where specific birds similarly carried associations with divine messengers or ancestral founders in regional mythology. As with the earlier comparative observations across this exploration, most mainstream researchers treat these parallels as reflecting a broadly shared human tendency to elevate powerful, distant, or symbolically resonant animals into ancestral or divine status, rather than evidence of any direct historical connection between geographically and culturally distant traditions. What remains firmly established, cutting through the genuine uncertainty surrounding its earliest origin, is the depth and continuity of the Eagle clan's ceremonial practice itself. Eagle gathering, the careful raising of eyases through the summer months, and the ceremonial conclusion of that relationship each year continue today essentially as they have for generations, maintained with a consistency that outside variation in origin narrative has apparently never disrupted. Whatever the true history behind the clan's earliest formation, the practical ceremonial relationship between the Hopi and the Eagles themselves has proven remarkably stable across a period of documented outside observation now stretching well over a century. This stability, set against the genuine uncertainty surrounding the clan's origin, raises a question distinct from most others traced across this exploration. In nearly every previous case, competing accounts have generally pointed toward a single underlying truth obscured by incomplete evidence or protective silence. The Eagle Clan's case may be different in kind rather than degree. Perhaps there is no single migration route waiting to be confirmed, no single village of origin still undiscovered, no single lineage whose story has simply been fragmented by time. Perhaps the Eagle Clan's identity was, from a genuinely early point, already a convergence rather than a single thread, which leaves this section circling back toward a question this exploration has now asked in several different forms. When a tradition holds multiple, seemingly incompatible accounts of its own beginning with equal confidence and equal ceremonial weight, is that evidence of a mystery still waiting to be solved? Or evidence that the beginning itself was never a single point at all? Whether the beginning itself was ever a single point remains, perhaps, unanswerable. But at the base of First Mesa, beneath the villages that stand today, the ground itself holds a more concrete kind of uncertainty. Not about origins so far removed they blur into cosmology, but about settlements considerably more recent, whose disappearance ought to be, by any reasonable expectation, one of the better documented episodes in Hopi history. It is not. First Mesa today is home to 3 villages: Walpi, perched dramatically at the mesa's narrow southern tip; Sikyatki, just below and beside it; and Hano, a Tiwa-speaking community whose own arrival on the mesa, following the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, is a distinct and separately documented chapter of southwestern history. These 3 villages, along with the surrounding archaeological landscape, represent one of the most continuously studied clusters of settlement in the entire Hopi historical record, examined by ethnographers, archaeologists, and Hopi cultural historians for well over a century. And yet beneath and around these standing villages, the archaeological record preserves clear evidence of earlier settlements on and around First Mesa, occupied before Walpi's current form took shape, whose specific identity, precise dating, and reasons for abandonment remain considerably less resolved than the mesa's later, better-known history. This is a genuinely different category of mystery from most examined so far in this exploration. It is not a question of a single dramatic event, like Awatovi's destruction or Sikyatki's contested fall. It is a quieter, more structural uncertainty involving multiple smaller settlements whose sequence, relationship to one another, and ultimate fate have simply never been fully reconstructed, despite over a century of sustained archaeological attention directed at the immediate area. Archaeological survey work across First Mesa and its base has identified evidence of earlier habitation sites, some apparently predating the current villages by several centuries, situated both directly beneath portions of the standing settlements and scattered across the talus slopes and flatter ground surrounding the mesa's base. Ceramic evidence recovered from these earlier sites suggests occupation extending back to at least the 12th or 13th century, placing this earlier settlement activity within the broader window of Hisatsinom migration and consolidation discussed earlier in this exploration. But unlike Awatovi, where a single, well-defined site cluster has been extensively excavated and directly tied to a specific clan tradition, the earlier settlement evidence around First Mesa is considerably more fragmented, scattered across multiple smaller locations rather than concentrated in one clearly bounded, thoroughly excavated site. This fragmentation is not, by itself, unusual for the region. What makes First Mesa's earlier settlement history genuinely puzzling is the comparative lack of clear oral tradition addressing it directly. Hopi clan histories, as this exploration has traced repeatedly, tend to describe specific settlement locations with at least some degree of narrative detail, even where geographic precision is limited, as in the Bear clan's case, or where the account itself is layered and complex, as with the Eagle clan. The earlier settlements around First Mesa, by contrast, receive comparatively little specific attention in the published record of Hopi oral tradition, at least as that tradition has been shared with outside researchers. Walpi's own founding is reasonably well documented, associated in Hopi tradition with a relocation of the village to its current, highly defensible position atop the mesa's narrow point, a move most accounts date to sometime after Spanish contact, likely motivated at least in part by defensive considerations following the increased regional instability of the 16th and 17th centuries. But the settlements that existed on and around the Mesa before that relocation, evidenced clearly enough in the archaeological record, do not appear to carry a correspondingly clear, specific oral history explaining who occupied them, why they were eventually abandoned or consolidated, or how directly their populations relate to the clans occupying Walpi, Sikyatki, and the broader First Mesa community today. Several explanations for this gap have been proposed, each carrying different implications for how the earlier settlements ought to be understood. The most straightforward explanation holds that no genuine mystery exists here at all, only an ordinary consequence of gradual, incremental settlement consolidation of the kind that rarely generates the same vivid, memorable oral tradition associated with sudden, dramatic events. Under this reading, the earlier settlements around First Mesa were not abandoned through catastrophe, conflict, or environmental crisis of the sort that tends to produce lasting, specific stories, but through a slow, unremarkable process of population movement toward increasingly defensible high ground, a shift occurring gradually enough across multiple generations that no single dramatic narrative moment emerged from it worth preserving in the same vivid detail as Sikyatki's fall or Awatovi's destruction. Gradual, undramatic history, this explanation suggests, is often simply gradual, undramatic history, significant to those living through it, but resistant to the kind of memorable narrative compression that keeps dramatic events alive across centuries of oral transmission. A second explanation, considerably more difficult to verify but consistent with patterns already discussed elsewhere in this exploration, proposes that the relative silence surrounding First Mesa's earlier settlements may reflect deliberate discretion rather than genuine narrative absence. Given the proximity of these earlier sites to Walpi's current position, and given the pattern already established at Awatovi, where oral tradition treats a specific site with unusual solemnity following violent events, some researchers have suggested that at least some of the earlier settlement consolidation around First Mesa may have involved conflict, absorption, or population displacement of a kind Hopi tradition has simply chosen not to elaborate on for outside audiences, whether due to its sensitive nature or its connection to specific, still relevant clan relationships among the communities living on the Mesa today. This possibility gains modest circumstantial support from limited archaeological evidence at some of the earlier sites, including localized evidence of structural burning at certain locations, though the scale, cause, and dating of this evidence remain too limited and inconsistently documented to support any confident conclusion about deliberate conflict, as opposed to the kind of accidental structural fire that can occur in any settlement over a long period of habitation. Unlike Awatovi, where oral tradition and archaeological evidence converge with unusual clarity, First Mesa's earlier settlement history offers neither element in sufficient detail to confirm or rule out this more speculative reading. A third line of interpretation, drawing on the broader pattern of population convergence discussed in relation to both the Horn Society and the Eagle Clan. Earlier in this exploration, proposes that First Mesa's earlier settlements may represent evidence of multiple, originally distinct population groups, gradually consolidating into what eventually became a single, unified Mesa-top community. Under this reading, the comparative lack of a single, coherent oral narrative addressing the earlier settlements directly would reflect not suppressed or forgotten history, but genuinely plural history. Multiple smaller groups, each with its own local tradition, converging over generations into the composite community later organized around Walpi's clan structure, their individually distinct earlier settlement histories gradually folded into the broader, more unified narrative framework that came to define First Mesa's identity as outside researchers eventually documented it. Comparative researchers examining broader patterns of settlement consolidation in other regions have noted similar dynamics in cases where smaller, dispersed populations gradually centralized around a single defensible or ceremonially significant location, from hilltop settlement consolidation documented across parts of ancient Europe to fortified highland consolidation patterns recorded in various regions of the ancient Near East and Palestine, where similarly dispersed earlier populations converged, often gradually, and without a single dramatic triggering event, into unified, more defensible communities during periods of regional instability. As with the comparative observations offered throughout this exploration, these parallels remain structural rather than evidentiary, useful primarily as a framework for understanding how gradual, undramatic consolidation processes elsewhere have sometimes produced exactly this kind of quiet historical gap. What can be said with confidence is that the archaeological evidence for earlier settlement on and around First Mesa is genuine, extensive enough to confirm sustained occupation well before Walpi's current form was established, and considerably less thoroughly integrated into published Hopi oral tradition than the comparably aged settlement histories associated with clans like the Patki or Bear. Whether this reflects an unremarkable, simply undramatic history, a deliberately guarded one, or a genuinely plural history whose individual threads were folded together long before outside documentation began, remains unresolved, and may, given the gradual nature of the process itself, resist the kind of clear resolution available for more dramatic singular events like Awatovi's destruction. Which leaves First Mesa holding a different kind of question than most examined so far in this exploration. Not what happened in a single decisive moment, but what happened across the accumulated weight of many smaller, unremembered ones, each too quiet on its own to survive as story, yet collectively responsible for shaping the very ground on which Walpi, Sikyatki, and Hano stand today. If the earlier settlements truly left no dramatic story behind, what does it mean that their absence itself has become one of the more persistent, if understated, mysteries in the entire Hopi historical record? What does it mean when absence itself becomes the mystery? Perhaps nowhere in Hopi tradition is that question posed more directly than in the story of a clan whose namesake is barely visible at all. Small, easily overlooked, spinning threads too fine to see except when the light catches them exactly right. And yet Hopi cosmology places this creature, and the clan associated with her, closer to the center of creation itself than almost any other figure this exploration has examined. The Spider Clan, Kokyangwudi, takes its name from Spider grandmother, Kokyangwudi, one of the most significant figures in Hopi origin tradition, credited in various accounts with assisting in the creation of the first humans, guiding the earliest ancestors through the emergence from previous worlds, and offering protective wisdom throughout the long migrations that followed. Her role recurs across multiple ceremonial contexts and story cycles, functioning less as a singular, bounded mythological character in the way outside audiences might expect, and more as a persistent guiding presence woven throughout Hopi cosmological narrative as a whole. Given Spider Grandmother's outsized cosmological significance, one might reasonably expect the Spider Clan itself, the human lineage bearing her name and claiming particular association with her, to occupy an unusually prominent, well-documented position within Hopi clan history. In certain respects, it does. The Spider Clan is consistently identified across ethnographic accounts as one of the more socially significant clans at several Hopi villages, and its ceremonial associations, particularly regarding weaving, protection, and certain aspects of the snake-antelope ceremonial complex discussed earlier in this exploration, are reasonably well documented. And yet the clan's specific arrival at the Mesas, the particular migration route that brought human descendants claiming Spider Grandmother's lineage into the Hopi social structure as it exists today, remains curiously underspecified compared to clans of similarly high ceremonial standing. This is a subtly different puzzle than those examined in the Eagle Clan's case, where the Eagle Clan's mystery involves multiple competing origin accounts coexisting without resolution. The Spider Clan's mystery involves something closer to a genuine gap. Comparatively few detailed migration accounts of any kind, competing or otherwise, addressing specifically how and when the clan bearing Spider Grandmother's name came to be recognized as a distinct lineage among the Hopi, as opposed to remaining simply an aspect of shared cosmological reverence available to all Hopi people, regardless of clan affiliation. Several factors may contribute to this comparative gap, and researchers examining the question have generally approached it from somewhat different angles. One relatively straightforward explanation holds that the Spider Clan's origin is, in an important sense, categorically different from clans like the Bear or Patki, whose migration accounts describe ordinary, if spiritually significant, human movement across a real, if imprecisely mapped, landscape. Spider Grandmother, by contrast, is understood in Hopi tradition as present from the very earliest moments of creation and emergence, existing prior to, and independent of, any specific migration narrative. Under this reading, a clan claiming her as namesake and particular protector might reasonably be expected to describe its own origin in less geographically specific terms than clans whose founding figures were understood as more conventionally human, precisely because the clan's core identity rests on a cosmological relationship rather than a claimed historical journey. The gap under this interpretation is not evidence of lost or suppressed information, but a natural consequence of the clan's identity being organized around a different kind of claim altogether, one where geographic migration detail was never the central point being preserved. A second explanation, offered by researchers paying closer attention to the specific pattern of Spider Clan ceremonial responsibility across different Hopi villages, proposes something closer to the composite origin pattern already discussed in relation to the Eagle Clan and the earlier first Mesa settlements. Under this reading, Spider Clan, as documented by outside ethnographers, may represent less a single lineage with one specific migration history, and more a ceremonial designation adopted independently at different points by different family groups across different villages, each claiming particular association with Spider Grandmother's protective and creative role without necessarily sharing a single common migration or point of origin. If accurate, this would mean the apparent gap in migration detail reflects not missing information about one clan's journey, but the genuine absence of any single such journey to document in the first place. The Spider Clan functioning more as a distributed ceremonial category than as a single bloodline with one traceable path to the Mesas. This possibility finds modest indirect support in the somewhat inconsistent way Spider Clan status and responsibility appear to be described across different Hopi villages in the available ethnographic record, with some accounts suggesting variation in the clan's specific standing and ceremonial role from one community to another that would be somewhat unusual, though not unprecedented, for a clan tracing to a single, shared migration history of the kind more clearly documented for clans like the Bear or Patki. A third, more speculative line of interpretation returns to a theme that has recurred throughout this exploration in various forms: the possibility that gaps of this kind preserve deliberate ceremonial discretion rather than genuine historical absence. Spider Grandmother's role in Hopi tradition includes elements of protection and guidance during moments of danger or transition, a role some Hopi commentators have described as carrying particular ceremonial sensitivity. Under this reading, specific details regarding the Spider Clan's arrival and early history may exist within Hopi tradition, but may be considered too closely tied to protective or otherwise sensitive ceremonial knowledge to share fully with outside researchers, in a manner conceptually similar to the discretion already discussed regarding the Fire Clan's deeper cosmological knowledge earlier in this exploration. Archaeology, as in several previous cases examined across this exploration, offers only indirect points of contact with these competing frameworks. Spider imagery appears across various forms of ancestral Puebloan and early Hopi material culture, including pottery motifs and rock art, extending back many centuries, confirming the deep antiquity of spider-related symbolism in the region generally, without confirming any specific single migration narrative tied to a particular clan, bearing that symbolism as its formal name. Weaving traditions, closely associated with the Spider Clan in ceremonial context, are similarly well documented archaeologically across the broader ancestral Puebloan world, extending back centuries before the earliest outside ethnographic documentation of Hopi clan structure specifically, again confirming deep practice without resolving the more specific question of clan origin and arrival. Comparative researchers working in the broader speculative register present throughout this exploration have occasionally noted that creator or guide figures associated with weaving, spinning, or thread-based symbolism appear across numerous unrelated global traditions, from various indigenous creation narratives across the Americas to spinning and weaving deities documented in ancient Mediterranean traditions, and further afield, symbolic associations between thread, fate, and creation, recorded in parts of the ancient Near East and Palestine, where weaving and spinning motifs similarly carried associations with cosmic order and creation in certain regional traditions. As throughout this exploration, most mainstream researchers regard these parallels as reflecting broadly shared human symbolic instincts around weaving and creation, given how nearly universal textile production was across ancient societies, rather than evidence of any specific historical connection between these geographically distant traditions. What remains firmly established is Spider Grandmother's deep, consistent centrality to Hopi cosmology as a whole, a centrality that appears to exceed, in scope and narrative weight, the more specific and comparatively modest documentation available regarding the Spider clan's own particular migration and arrival. This asymmetry, a cosmological figure of immense significance paired with an oddly underdocumented human lineage bearing her name, distinguishes the Spider clan's mystery from most others examined across this exploration, where clan prominence and origin documentation have generally moved together, whether clearly as with the Patki or contentiously as with the Eagle clan. Whether this asymmetry reflects a clan whose identity was always more cosmological than genealogical, a composite designation adopted independently across multiple villages rather than descending from one shared journey, or simply another instance of protective discretion surrounding knowledge considered too sensitive to fully document, remains genuinely unresolved, and the available evidence does not clearly favor one explanation over the others, which leaves the Spider clan story circling back to something close to the heart of Spider Grandmother's own role throughout Hopi tradition, present everywhere, credited with guiding nearly everything, and yet, in the end, never quite fully seen. If her clan's arrival at the Mesas was never recorded with the same geographic precision afforded to others, was that because the details were simply never considered necessary to preserve, or because the thread connecting her clan to its own beginning was always meant to remain exactly as fine and exactly as difficult to trace as the webs she is remembered for weaving? Never quite fully seen, that could describe Spider Grandmother's thread, but it applies just as well to something far more concrete. A relationship between two neighboring peoples, sustained across centuries, visible in pottery, in ceremony, in language borrowed back and forth across a shared landscape, and yet never fully documented in the kind of formal record that would let historians say, with confidence, exactly what it was. East of the Hopi Mesas, across roughly 100 miles of high desert plateau, sits the pueblo of Zuni, in what is now western New Mexico. The Zuni, or Ashiwi, represent a distinct Puebloan people with their own language, isolated linguistically from every other Puebloan group in the Southwest, and their own separate migration and origin traditions. And yet the historical, ceremonial, and material connections between the Hopi and Zuni peoples run deep enough and far back enough that some researchers have described the relationship not merely as neighborly contact, but as something closer to sustained alliance, one whose formal terms, if any existed, have never been clearly reconstructed from either the archaeological or the documentary record. The evidence for sustained contact is genuinely substantial. Trade goods move consistently between Hopi and Zuni archaeological sites across many centuries, including turquoise, shell, ceramics, and textiles, reflecting an active, ongoing exchange network rather than occasional incidental contact. Ceremonial exchange appears equally significant. Certain Hopi and Zuni ceremonies show structural and thematic similarities substantial enough that researchers have long debated the direction, and even the possibility, of ceremonial borrowing between the two peoples, including elements of Kachina tradition, which appears in related but distinct forms among both the Hopi and the Zuni, alongside broader Puebloan groups along the Rio Grande. Some Hopi clans, including branches of clans already discussed in this exploration, describe migration accounts that pass through or near Zuni territory, occasionally referencing periods of extended contact, intermarriage, or temporary settlement among Zuni communities before continuing on toward the mesas. What is notably absent, however, is anything resembling a formal historical or oral account describing a specific alliance, treaty, or coordinated political relationship between the two peoples, of the kind that might be expected given the depth and consistency of the material and ceremonial connections. Compare this to the Bear Clan's clear, if geographically vague, migration account, or the well-corroborated Patki clan history at Homolovi. The Hopi-Zuni relationship, despite leaving considerably more material evidence of sustained contact than several individual clan migrations already examined, resists being organized into any single, coherent historical narrative of the kind outside researchers might expect for a relationship this consequential. This absence becomes more striking rather than less when set against the documented history of actual military cooperation between the two peoples during a specific well-recorded period, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, discussed earlier in relation to Awatovi's mission and its eventual destruction. Both Hopi and Zuni communities participated in the coordinated uprising against Spanish colonial authority, and in the revolt's aftermath, some historical accounts describe limited coordination, including intermittent shared defensive concerns, between Hopi and Zuni communities during the tense decades that followed, as Spanish authority attempted, with partial and ultimately temporary success, to reassert control across the region. This period offers the clearest documented instance of anything resembling formal political cooperation between the two peoples in the entire historical record, and even this cooperation appears loosely coordinated and locally variable, rather than governed by any single overarching agreement. Given this comparatively thin formal record, several explanations have been proposed for why a relationship with such extensive material and ceremonial evidence left so little behind in the way of clearly documented formal alliance. The most straightforward explanation, favored by many historians working from the available documentary and archaeological evidence, holds that no single formal alliance ever existed in the sense modern audiences might expect from that term. Under this reading, the Hopi-Zuni relationship should be understood as a long, genuinely significant, but fundamentally informal pattern of sustained trade, intermarriage, and periodic ceremonial exchange, shaped by geographic proximity and shared regional pressures, including drought, Spanish colonization, and later American territorial expansion, rather than by any specific negotiated political agreement of the kind that might generate the sort of formal record historians typically look for. Under this interpretation, the absence of a clear alliance narrative is not a gap in the record at all, but an accurate reflection of a relationship that was always closer to sustained neighborliness than formal political partnership, however deep and consequential that neighborliness became over time. A second explanation, offered by researchers examining the specific ceremonial overlap between the two peoples more closely, proposes that at least some periods of the relationship may have involved considerably more formal coordination than the surviving record suggests, particularly regarding shared defensive concerns during the unstable decades following the Pueblo Revolt. But that this coordination, precisely because it touched on ceremonial and defensive matters considered sensitive within both traditions, was never intended to be preserved in a form accessible to outside documentation. Under this reading, similar in structure to explanations already offered elsewhere in this exploration regarding the Fire Clan and Spider Clan, the absence of formal record reflects deliberate discretion on the part of both communities, rather than the genuine absence of formal coordination itself. A third, more speculative line of interpretation, drawing on the broader archaeological pattern of Puebloan resettlement and consolidation following the mass abandonments of the 13th through 15th centuries discussed throughout this exploration, proposes that the Hopi-Zuni relationship may preserve traces of a considerably older, more formalized regional coordination network, one that predates both peoples' current identities as distinct, separately organized nations. Under this reading, the deep ceremonial overlap, shared Kachina tradition elements, and sustained trade connections might represent surviving fragments of a broader, once more formally structured regional system, connecting multiple Puebloan and pre-Puebloan communities across the Colorado Plateau during the period of major population consolidation following the Hisatsinom migrations, a system whose specific formal structure, if it existed, was gradually replaced by the more localized, village-specific and nation-specific political organization that came to characterize both Hopi and Zuni society by the time of Spanish contact and outside documentation. This more speculative framework finds partial, indirect support in the broader regional archaeological pattern already discussed in relation to Hohokam Hopi contact earlier in this exploration, where sustained trade and ceremonial exchange across considerable distances similarly left extensive material evidence without a correspondingly clear formal political record. Comparative researchers examining regional trade and ceremonial networks in other parts of the ancient world have noted similar patterns among neighboring but linguistically and politically distinct peoples, maintaining sustained exchange relationships without necessarily formalizing them into documented treaties, from various neighboring civilizations across ancient Mesoamerica to trade and ceremonial relationships documented among neighboring but politically separate communities throughout the ancient Near East and Palestine, where extensive material and religious exchange similarly often outpace the survival of any formal treaty record specifically governing the relationship. As with earlier comparative observations across this exploration, these parallels remain structural rather than evidentiary, offered as useful context rather than direct proof of any particular explanation. What remains firmly established is the depth and consistency of Hopi-Zuni contact across many centuries, reflected in trade goods, ceremonial parallels, clan migration accounts passing through shared territory, and documented cooperation during the Pueblo Revolt period specifically. What remains genuinely unresolved is whether this sustained, substantial relationship ever crossed the threshold into something historians could reasonably call formal alliance. Whether such an alliance existed but was deliberately kept outside the documented record, or whether the relationship represents the surviving fragments of an even older, more broadly structured regional system whose original formal shape has been lost to the same long process of consolidation and transformation. This exploration is traced across nearly every settlement, clan, and ceremony examined so far, which leaves the question suspended somewhere between the pottery shards and the kiva walls of two neighboring peoples who have traded, prayed, and occasionally fought alongside each other for longer than either people's written history extends. Was there ever a formal agreement binding the Hopi and Zuni together, waiting somewhere in ceremonial memory neither community has chosen to fully share? Or does the true nature of their bond lie precisely in never having needed one at all? Whether such a bond ever needed a formal name is one kind of question. But some traditions resist documentation not because they were deliberately hidden, but because their very structure, tied to sound rather than object, to breath rather than artifact, was never suited to survive in the way a tablet or a treaty might. Few Hopi ceremonies illustrate this more clearly than the one performed in alternating years with Wu Chim, carried not by fire or by silence, but by music. The flute ceremony, Lenmongwi in its leadership designation, stands alongside Wu Wuchim as one of the four major ceremonies structuring the Hopi ritual calendar, discussed earlier in this exploration in connection with the Fire Clan's central ceremonial role. Where Wu Wuchim is performed in odd-numbered years and centers on themes of creation and emergence, the flute ceremony is performed in even-numbered years and is associated instead with themes of renewal, the opening of springs, and the continuation of the agricultural cycle the Hopi have depended upon for as long as their oral tradition extends. Conducted primarily by two distinct flute societies, commonly referred to in ethnographic literature as the Blue Flute and Gray Flute societies, associated respectively with different villages and different specific ceremonial responsibilities. The ceremony culminates in a public procession featuring flute music, ceremonial standards, and ritual visits to specific springs considered sacred to the communities involved. Unlike Wu Wuchim, whose deepest content remains largely shielded from outside documentation, the flute ceremony has been reasonably well observed and recorded by outside ethnographers, including detailed accounts from Fuchs in the 1890s, and subsequent researchers throughout the 20th century. Its outward structure, its public procession, its association with specific springs, and its alternating relationship with Wu Wuchim are documented with a level of consistency and detail unusual even by the standards of the better documented ceremonies discussed across this exploration. And yet the ceremony's origin, specifically how flute music itself came to occupy such a central ceremonial role among the Hopi, and why this particular ceremony developed its close structural relationship with Wuwuchim rather than existing as an entirely separate tradition remains far less clearly explained than its outward performance. Hopi tradition associated with the ceremony's origin generally centers on the Flute clan, whose own migration and origin account, much like the Snake clan tradition discussed earlier in this exploration, involves an encounter framed outside ordinary human history. Various accounts describe the Flute clan's earliest ancestors as having received the ceremony's foundational knowledge, including the specific flute music and its associated ritual sequence, through contact with beings or forces existing outside conventional human society, in a manner structurally similar to the Snake clan's encounter with the Snake people described earlier, though the specific details of the Flute clan's origin account are less consistently documented across available ethnographic sources than the Snake clan's more thoroughly recorded tradition. This relative documentation gap is itself worth pausing on. The snake dance's dramatic, visually striking public performance drew outside observers, and their detailed questioning, in a way the Flute ceremony's comparatively quieter, more musically oriented procession did not attract to the same degree, despite the Flute ceremony's equal standing within the Hopi ceremonial calendar. Outside curiosity, in other words, appears to have shaped which traditions received the most thorough outside documentation, independent of which traditions Hopi communities themselves considered most significant. This raises a subtle but important methodological question relevant to nearly every mystery examined across this exploration. How much of what remains genuinely unclear about Hopi historical tradition reflects deliberate protective silence, and how much simply reflects where outside ethnographic attention happened, somewhat arbitrarily, to focus most intensively during the limited windows when documentation occurred at all. Musicologically, the flutes themselves, and the specific musical structure associated with the ceremony, present a further layer of genuine uncertainty. The flutes used in the ceremony are understood within Hopi tradition to require specific construction methods and specific tuning considered appropriate to their ceremonial function, knowledge maintained within the flute societies themselves rather than shared as general craft knowledge across the broader community. Ethnomusicologists examining Puebloan flute traditions more broadly have noted that southwestern indigenous flute music, including but not limited to Hopi tradition specifically, reflects tuning systems and construction techniques distinct from other documented indigenous flute traditions across North America, suggesting a genuinely old, locally developed musical tradition rather than one adopted wholesale from neighboring or distant cultures. This lends a degree of material grounding to the ceremony's claimed antiquity, even where the specific narrative explaining its origin remains comparatively underdocumented. Archaeological evidence offers modest additional support. Flutes and flute fragments, along with imagery depicting flute-playing figures, appear in the archaeological record across the broader ancestral Puebloan Southwest, including rock art and kiva mural fragments at several major sites already discussed in this exploration, extending back many centuries before the earliest outside ethnographic documentation of the Hopi flute ceremony specifically. The famous humpbacked flute player figure, widely known outside the Southwest under the more general and considerably less precise popular label, sometimes applied to similar figures across different Southwestern cultures, appears in rock art across a wide geographic area, spanning multiple distinct ancestral Puebloan traditions, suggesting flute playing held broad ceremonial or symbolic significance across the region long before any single group's specific ceremonial tradition, Hopi or otherwise, had developed into the form later documented by outside researchers. This broader regional pattern complicates any attempt to trace the flute ceremony's origin to a single specific point of development within Hopi tradition alone. If flute playing carried ceremonial significance across a wide swath of the ancestral Puebloan world for centuries before the emergence of the specific structured ceremony now associated with the Hopi ritual calendar, then the flute ceremony's origin may represent not the invention of an entirely new tradition, but the formal, Hopi-specific consolidation and structuring of a considerably older, more widely shared regional musical ceremonial practice, similar in structure to the broader absorption pattern already discussed in relation to the Horn Society earlier in this exploration. Some researchers working in a more speculative register have proposed that the flute ceremony's alternating relationship with Wuwuchim and its specific association with themes of renewal and the reopening of springs may preserve genuine institutional memory of ancient water management knowledge extending back considerably further than the ceremony's currently documented form, potentially connecting to the same deep well of practical water knowledge already discussed in relation to the Patki clan's specialized relationship with unpredictable water sources. Under this reading, the flute ceremony's core function, ritually marking and reinforcing the community's relationship with specific, named springs, considered essential to agricultural survival, may represent one of the oldest continuously maintained elements of the entire Hopi ceremonial system, its musical form simply the most recent and most thoroughly outside documented layer of a considerably older practical and spiritual tradition. Comparative researchers have occasionally noted that ceremonial musical traditions specifically associated with water, renewal, and agricultural fertility appear across numerous ancient agricultural societies worldwide, from various flute and wind instrument traditions documented across ancient Mesoamerica to ceremonial musical practices associated with seasonal renewal, recorded in parts of the ancient Near East and Palestine, where wind instruments similarly carried associations with fertility, renewal, and the marking of agricultural transition points in regional ceremonial calendars. As throughout this exploration, most mainstream researchers regard these parallels as reflecting broadly shared human ceremonial responses to agricultural dependency on unpredictable water and seasonal cycles, rather than evidence of specific historical connection between geographically distant and culturally unrelated traditions. What remains firmly established is the flute ceremony's deep integration into the Hopi ceremonial calendar, its close structural partnership with Wuwuchim, and the genuine antiquity of flute-related ceremonial practice across the broader ancestral Puebloan Southwest, extending well back before outside documentation began. What remains considerably less clear is the specific historical process by which this broader regional tradition became the particular, Hopi-specific ceremony maintained today by the Blue Flute and Gray Flute societies, and how much of the Flute clan's own origin account, thinly documented relative to comparable traditions like the Snake clans, might still exist in fuller form within ceremonial contexts, simply never open to outside observation, which leaves the flute ceremony's origin resting somewhere between the well-documented present and a considerably murkier past, its music carrying forward a tradition whose outward form has been observed, recorded, and studied for well over a century, even as the deeper question of exactly how and from whom that music was first received remains, appropriately enough, a note that has never quite resolved. A note that never quite resolved is one way to describe an old internal tradition. But not every unresolved chapter in Hopi religious history originated within Hopi tradition itself. Some arrived from outside, carried across hundreds of miles by messengers convinced the world itself was about to change, and the question of exactly how the Hopi responded to that message and what became of it afterward remains oddly thin for an episode that, elsewhere across the American West, reshaped entire nations' religious and political trajectories. In the closing decades of the 19th century, a religious movement known as the Ghost Dance spread rapidly across many native nations of the western United States, originating with the northern Paiute prophet Wovoka in what is now Nevada. Wovoka's teaching, delivered following a vision experienced during a solar eclipse in January of 1889, promised the renewal of the natural world, the return of deceased ancestors, and the restoration of native lands and ways of life, achieved through peaceful ceremonial dance and righteous living rather than armed resistance. The movement spread with remarkable speed across the plains and Great Basin regions, reaching, among many other nations, the Lakota, whose adoption of the movement is most widely remembered today, tragically, in connection with the Wounded Knee massacre of December 1890, when U.S. Army forces killed several hundred Lakota men, women, and children at Pine Ridge, an event that effectively ended large-scale visible ghost dance practice across most of the affected nations in its aftermath. The ghost dance movement spread was not limited to the plains, however. Historical and ethnographic evidence confirms that word of Wovoka's teaching reached considerably further, including into Hopi territory, carried by traveling messengers and delegates dispatched from various participating nations specifically to spread the prophet's message, and, in some cases, to verify Wovoka's teachings through direct pilgrimage to Nevada itself. Documentation from this period, including Federal Indian Agency records and later ethnographic accounts, confirms that at least some Hopi individuals were aware of, and in limited documented instances directly engaged with, ghost dance teachings during this period. What remains genuinely unclear and considerably less thoroughly documented than the movement's impact among Plains nations is precisely how the Hopi as a broader community responded to this outside religious message, arriving as it did during the same turbulent final decades of the 19th century that would soon produce the Oraibi split of 1906, discussed earlier in this exploration. Did ghost dance teachings find genuine, if limited, adoption among specific Hopi individuals or factions? Did the movement's core themes, the promised return of ancestors, the renewal of the natural world, the restoration of traditional ways of life, resonate with, or perhaps even draw upon, existing Hopi prophetic tradition already discussed at length in connection with the Blue Star Kachina prophecy earlier in this exploration? Or did the Hopi, already possessing their own detailed, internally coherent prophetic framework regarding purification and renewal, largely decline meaningful engagement with an externally originating movement offering broadly similar promises through an unfamiliar ceremonial structure? The available documentary evidence supports elements of multiple possible answers without clearly resolving the question in favor of any single one. Federal agency records from the period, while confirming Hopi awareness of ghost dance activity generally, provide relatively limited detail regarding the specific scale or intensity of any Hopi engagement with the movement, in notable contrast to the considerably more extensive federal documentation generated regarding ghost dance activity among Plains nations, where government concern about the movement's political and social implications drove considerably more intensive surveillance and record-keeping. This documentation gap may simply reflect a genuine difference in scale, with Hopi engagement never reaching a level that attracted comparable federal attention, or it may reflect the more general pattern already observed across this exploration, in which outside documentation of Hopi religious life has often proven inconsistent, shaped as much by which topics attracted sustained ethnographic curiosity as by the actual relative significance of the traditions themselves within Hopi community life. Some later ethnographic accounts, including scattered references collected by researchers working among the Hopi in the early 20th century, suggest that ghost dance teachings, where they were encountered, may have been evaluated by Hopi religious leadership against the community's own existing prophetic framework, rather than adopted as an independent parallel tradition. Under this reading, favored by several researchers examining the limited evidence, the Hopi's own detailed prophetic tradition, already anticipating renewal and purification through a framework developed and maintained internally across many preceding generations, may have functioned as a kind of interpretive filter, allowing Hopi observers to recognize thematic parallels with Wovoka's teaching, without necessarily requiring wholesale adoption of the external movement's specific ceremonial practices. This would help explain why ghost dance activity among the Hopi never developed into anything resembling the large-scale, visible movement documented among the Lakota and other Plains nations, despite apparent Hopi awareness of, and at least some documented engagement with, the broader movement during the same period. A second explanation, offered by researchers focusing more closely on the specific political and social circumstances at the Hopi Mesas during this exact period, connects the relative quiet surrounding Hopi ghost dance engagement to the broader internal tension already building toward the Oraibi split, discussed earlier in this exploration. Under this reading, the same underlying disagreement over how to respond to increasing federal pressure and assimilation policy that would eventually fracture Oraibi in 1906 may have similarly shaped how different Hopi factions responded to ghost dance teachings arriving during the preceding decade, with more traditionalist community members potentially finding greater resonance with a message promising restoration of traditional ways, while more accommodation-minded community members may have viewed engagement with an externally originating, federally monitored religious movement as an unnecessary risk during an already precarious period of negotiation with federal authority. If accurate, this would mean Hopi ghost dance engagement, however limited its documented scale, may represent an early, quieter manifestation of the same underlying factional tension that would erupt more visibly and dramatically at Oraibi, roughly 15 years later. A third, more speculative line of inquiry, consistent with the broader comparative pattern present throughout this exploration, has proposed that apparent thematic overlap between ghost dance teachings and existing Hopi prophetic tradition, both centered on renewal, purification, and the restoration of proper relationship between human communities and the natural world, may reflect something considerably deeper than simple historical coincidence or straightforward doctrinal borrowing. Some researchers working at the edges of comparative religious study have noted that revitalization movements sharing broadly similar structural features, a charismatic prophet, a vision experienced during a significant celestial or natural event, promises of ancestral return and world renewal, achieved through righteous ceremonial practice, appear across numerous historical contexts worldwide during periods of severe social and cultural pressure, from various documented revitalization movements among colonized peoples globally, to comparable prophetic and messianic movements recorded across the ancient Near East and Palestine during periods of foreign occupation and cultural crisis. Under this reading, the apparent resonance between ghost dance teaching and existing Hopi prophecy would reflect not specific historical transmission in either direction, but a broadly shared human religious response to comparable conditions of external pressure and cultural threat, a pattern most mainstream researchers regard as considerably more plausible than any theory proposing direct historical connection between distant and culturally unrelated traditions. What can be said with confidence, distinguishing this section from several others examined across this exploration, is that the underlying historical event, Wovoka's teaching and its documented spread across the western United States during this specific, well-recorded period, is not itself in serious dispute. What remains genuinely unresolved is the considerably narrower, more specific question of how deeply and in what particular form that external teaching was received, evaluated, and ultimately either incorporated or set aside within Hopi religious and social life during this critical transitional period, one already under considerable strain from the federal pressures that would soon produce the fracture at Oraibi. This gap matters more than it might initially appear, precisely because it sits at the intersection of two major forces already traced separately across this exploration: the deep, internally consistent Hopi prophetic tradition centered on the blue star Kachina, and the specific mounting external pressures of federal assimilation policy that would soon divide Oraibi so visibly and dramatically. If the Hopi response to ghost dance teaching does, in fact, preserve an early record of how these two forces first interacted, then a genuinely significant piece of the broader story connecting Hopi prophecy to the specific historical pressures of the late 19th century remains only partially recovered, its fuller shape obscured by the same uneven pattern of outside documentation already encountered repeatedly throughout this exploration, which leaves this particular chapter suspended in a familiar, if distinct, kind of uncertainty. Not a tradition deliberately hidden, and not, so far as the evidence suggests, a tradition that never meaningfully arrived at all, but something quieter than either. A message that reached the Mesas, was heard, was weighed against knowledge already held, and then, for reasons the record does not fully preserve, simply faded from visible practice, leaving behind only the question of how much it may have shaped what came next. How much a message may have shaped what came next is a question this exploration keeps returning to from different centuries. To find its earliest instance among the Hopi, one has to travel back nearly 350 years before Wovoka's vision, to a moment before any Spanish soldier, priest, or document had yet set foot on the mesas, when Hopi society was governed entirely by its own traditional leadership, unrecorded by any outside hand, and about to encounter for the first time a form of contact it had no prior framework for interpreting. Spanish expeditions first reached Hopi territory in 1540, when a detachment from Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's larger expedition, led by Pedro de Tovar, arrived at the Hopi villages seeking information about the region, and, as with much of Coronado's broader expedition, pursuing rumors of wealth that would ultimately prove unfounded. This initial contact was brief, and according to Spanish accounts, involved some degree of resistance before the Hopi villages agreed to provide the expedition with supplies and safe passage. Sustained Spanish presence at the Hopi Mesas did not begin until decades later, with the establishment of Franciscan missions in the early 17th century, including the mission at Awatovi discussed earlier in this exploration. Between these two moments, the initial brief contact of 1540 and the beginning of sustained missionary presence roughly 60 years later, lies a genuinely obscure stretch of Hopi political and religious history, one this exploration has largely approached only indirectly, through the lens of specific ceremonies, specific clans, and specific settlements. This section turns instead to the leadership structure itself during this critical window. The traditional village leaders, ceremonial authorities, and clan heads who governed Hopi society in the decades immediately before Spanish missionary influence began reshaping village life, and whose specific fate, individually and collectively, during the transition into the mission period remains almost entirely undocumented. This gap is, in one sense, unsurprising. Hopi society during this period maintained no written record of its own in the form outside historians typically rely upon, and Spanish documentation, where it exists at all for this specific window, focuses overwhelmingly on broader expedition logistics, geographic description, and, in the mission period specifically, matters of religious conversion and administration, rather than on the internal structure of Hopi governance the missionaries encountered and, in various ways, sought to reshape. The specific individuals holding ceremonial and political authority among the Hopi during the mid to late 16th century, the traditional leaders governing in the decades between Tovar's brief visit and the arrival of the first resident missionaries, are simply not named, described, or otherwise documented in any surviving source available to outside researchers. And yet this documentation gap carries particular significance, given what this exploration has already traced regarding the ceremonial and clan-based leadership structure the Spanish would eventually encounter and disrupt. The Fire Clan's cosmological seniority, the Bear Clan's governance role at Oraibi, the complex, multi-layered structure of clan authority discussed at length earlier in this exploration, all of this presumably existed in some functioning form during the pre-mission decades this section examines, governed by specific individuals whose names, decisions, and eventual fates have simply not survived in any form outside researchers can currently access. Several lines of reasoning have been offered by historians and Hopi cultural scholars attempting to address this gap, none providing anything resembling a complete resolution. The most straightforward approach, adopted by most conventional historians working with the limited available evidence, treats the absence of specific leadership records for this period as an unavoidable consequence of documentation timing, rather than evidence of any particular historical event or deliberate erasure. Under this reading, traditional Hopi leadership during the pre-mission decades likely continued functioning in essentially the same clan-based, ceremonially organized structure documented more thoroughly by later ethnographers working after sustained outside contact began, with no reason to assume any dramatic disruption occurred during this specific window, beyond the ordinary, gradual generational transition of leadership that any functioning society experiences continuously. The gap in this reading is simply a gap, reflecting the absence of any outside observer present to record events during a period when Hopi society had little reason to document its own leadership transitions in a form legible to later outside researchers. A second line of inquiry, considerably more attentive to the specific historical pressures beginning to emerge during this window, notes that the mid to late 16th century coincided with broader disruption across the Southwest more generally, as Spanish colonial activity intensified throughout the region even in areas like the Hopi Mesas that did not yet host permanent Spanish settlement or mission presence. Disease, introduced through indirect contact along expanding trade and contact networks radiating outward from more directly colonized areas to the south, is documented as having affected Puebloan populations across the broader southwest during this general period, sometimes preceding sustained direct European contact by years or even decades, as pathogens spread more quickly than colonizers themselves along existing indigenous trade routes. Whether Hopi communities specifically experience comparable disease impact during this pre-mission window, and whether such impact may have disrupted traditional leadership continuity through the loss of specific ceremonial or clan leaders before any Spanish observer was present to document the loss, remains entirely unconfirmed for the Hopi specifically, though the broader regional pattern makes the possibility difficult to dismiss outright. A third, more speculative line of interpretation offered by researchers examining the later documented tensions between traditionalist and accommodation-minded Hopi factions, tensions already discussed at length in this exploration regarding both Awatovi's destruction and the 1906 Oraibi split, has proposed that the roots of this recurring factional pattern, communities repeatedly dividing over how far to accommodate outside religious and political pressure, may extend back further than the specific well-documented instances already examined, potentially originating in decisions made by traditional leadership during this earliest, undocumented window of indirect Spanish contact and influence. Under this reading, the initial brief encounter with Tovar's expedition in 1540, however limited in its immediate impact, may have introduced the first seeds of a leadership disagreement over appropriate response to outside contact, a disagreement whose specific early form is lost entirely to the documentation gap this section examines, but whose underlying pattern, traditionalist caution weighed against pragmatic accommodation, would resurface repeatedly across the following centuries, in forms this exploration has already traced in considerable detail. This more speculative framework cannot currently be confirmed through any direct evidence specific to this early period, given the near-total absence of documentation already discussed. It remains, at most, a structural hypothesis, drawing on the clearly recurring pattern visible in later, better documented periods to propose a plausible, if unverifiable, origin point earlier than the record can currently support. Archaeological evidence offers limited additional insight for this specific question, given that the kind of evidence typically most useful in identifying specific leadership transitions, distinctive burial practices associated with high-status individuals, architectural changes reflecting shifts in ceremonial or political authority, has not been systematically documented for Hopi sites specifically dating to this narrow mid to late 16th century window, in part because Hopi communities have historically discouraged the kind of invasive excavation that might otherwise help address this specific gap, a pattern already discussed in this exploration regarding Sikyatki and other sensitive ancestral sites. Comparative historians examining similarly undocumented leadership transitions during early stages of indirect colonial contact in other parts of the world have noted broadly similar patterns, periods immediately preceding sustained direct contact often proving to be among the least documented in a colonized society's history, precisely because indigenous societies during this window had not yet developed the kind of engagement with outside documentation systems that later periods of sustained contact would produce, while outside observers had not yet arrived in sufficient numbers or with sufficient established interest to generate their own independent record. This pattern has been noted in colonial contexts from various regions of the Americas, to periods of early, indirect foreign contact and influence recorded in parts of the ancient Near East and Palestine, where similar gaps often exist between initial, brief outside contact and the beginning of more sustained, better documented engagement. As throughout this exploration, these comparisons remain structural rather than evidentiary, offered as context for a documentation pattern that appears to recur wherever societies experience this particular kind of gradual, indirect prelude to sustained outside contact. What remains firmly established is the broad historical framework surrounding this period. Tovar's brief 1540 contact, the roughly 6-decade gap before sustained missionary presence began, and the well-documented leadership and ceremonial structure that later, better recorded periods clearly show functioning at the Mesas. What remains genuinely lost is the specific human history connecting these two better documented points. the names, decisions, and ultimate fates of the traditional leaders who governed Hopi society through this critical, unrecorded transition. Men and women whose choices, whatever they were, shaped the foundation upon which every subsequent chapter examined across this exploration, from Awatovi's destruction to Oraibi's fracture, would eventually unfold. Which leaves this particular gap perhaps the most quietly consequential of any examined so far. Not because the mystery itself is more dramatic than others already traced, but because it sits at the very root of nearly everything that follows. An entire generation of leadership governing during the exact window when Hopi society first began, however indirectly, to reckon with an outside world it had never previously needed to consider, whose specific decisions, struggles, and losses have vanished so completely that even their names did not survive to be remembered, let alone questioned.